He was 24 years old. His father was holding his hand, holding it tightly. That's not how you hold a son. That's how you hold a vessel that might jerk away. A cold stone lay beneath his back. A white bone lamp hung above his head. 11 people stood in the hall. All of them bore the blood of the Conval house. No one looked him in the eyes. They looked only at his chest. There, beneath his skin, his source smoldered. 6 measures of light. Everything he had gathered over 24 years. Everything he had scraped together from other people's leftovers and empty pantries. His sister knelt down beside him. She was 29. Her palm rested on his sternum. She said he was doing a great deed for the clan. She said his name would be inscribed in the lists of pillars. He wanted to reply. His voice would no longer come out. His father turned his head toward his grandfather and nodded. His grandfather lowered his eyelids. The rite of withdrawal began. First, the warmth left his fingers. Then from his abdomen. Then a pulling sensation came from deep within his chest, as if a root were being torn out from there, along with the earth. He saw the light leaving him and entering her. He saw her face. It wasn't one of gratitude. It was one of satisfaction. That's what a person looks like who has finally received something they've long awaited. The last thing he heard was the manager's voice. The manager calmly called out the numbers. 4 measures. 5 measures. 5.5. Then the count ended. Then he ended. Then there was bottomless darkness. Then there was a smell. It smelled of wet straw and the smoke of a brazier. Issen opened his eyes and saw a low ceiling made of dark planks. He knew that ceiling. He had stared at it for the first 16 years of his life. He raised his hand. It was a child's hand, a slender wrist, a broken nail on his middle finger. He'd broken it while hauling buckets from the lower well. He was 8 years old. He sat down on the cot and didn't move for a long time. The House of Conval stood on the eastern slope and owned 3 villages and 1 mine. The House of Conval relied on one thing: the source. Everyone born of this blood carried a source of light within them. The source was measured in units. 1 unit was divided into 10 parts. An ordinary child at age 8 had 1 unit. An adult warrior had between 8 and 12. The depth of the source decided everything: who sat at the head table, who received meat, and who received a name. Issen had 1 measure. His older sister Sarion had 9 at the age of 13. No one in the 3 neighboring valleys had 9 measures at the age of 13. She was called the pride of the eastern slope. For her sake, the household borrowed money. For her sake, they brought herbs from the coast. For her sake, they kept Issen. He only understood this once he was on the stone. At 8 years old, he hadn't understood it yet. Now he understood. His room was in the far wing above the storeroom. He was fed after the dogs, but before the beggars. They didn't beat him too hard. A battered vessel will crack. They spared him just enough so that he would grow to the necessary depth. He let his feet touch the floor and looked at his palms. 16 years lay ahead. 24 years of pain were behind him. He stood up and walked toward the common courtyard. The morning roll call was held by the Eastern Gallery. They stood in order of seniority. Sarion was in front. Behind her was her 11-year-old cousin, Desu. Behind him were 4 more children of the clan. Issen stood last, against the wall. Yanhee's mother walked along the line and adjusted Sarion's collar. She passed by Issen without turning her head. Father Gisan stood by a post, looking out into the courtyard. He was the head of the branch and held a rank of 14 measures. He did not look at his youngest son even once. Manager Pyong carried out a tray. There were bowls on the tray. Pyong was a gaunt old man with a straight back and an expressionless face. He was handing out the fortifying decoction to the children. Dark, bitter, smelling of iron and bark. Ison knew that smell. He had been drinking that decoction for 14 years straight. He only learned the truth about it at the age of 22, when he overheard a conversation between the herbalist and his father. The decoction did not strengthen him. The decoction stunted the source's growth. The decoction made the light soft and pliable. Such light is easier to take away. Such light offers no resistance on stone. They had been feeding it to him since he was 6. Pyun reached the end of the line and held out the bowl to him. Everyone was waiting for the usual routine. The boy takes the bowl with both hands. The boy bows. The boy drinks and grimaces. That's how it had been every morning for 8 years. Ison took the bowl with one hand. He turned toward the wooden tub where the old pomegranate tree grew. He turned the bowl upside down over the ground. The brew seeped into the roots with a soft hiss. He didn't take his eyes off Pyung while he poured. The courtyard fell silent. Pyung didn't move. The old man's skin twitched beneath his left eye, just once. He had served the household for 40 years and had seen many a child's whim. He had never seen a child look at him like that, without fear, without defiance, the way a person looks who knows the contents of the bowl better than the one who carried it. His mother was the first to approach and struck Ison on the arm. The bowl fell and shattered. She said he was bringing shame upon the family in front of the servants. She said he would go without dinner that evening. He lowered his head and did not answer. His father turned at the sound and looked not at his son, but at the shards. He told Pyung that the cost of the tableware would be deducted from the allowance for the far wing. Then he left. Desu laughed the loudest of all. Saryon looked at her brother with a long, steady gaze and turned away. There was no malice in her gaze. It held the curiosity of a housewife toward a cracked object. The line broke up. The courtyard emptied. And then silence fell. It came from within. The sounds of the courtyard receded and grew flat. The wind stopped mid-blow. A pomegranate leaf hung in the air, not quite reaching the ground. Ison felt something cold and very ancient open up beneath his breastbone. It did not speak with a voice. He simply came to know it completely. Every bearer of the blood of Convul who uses it, humiliates it, or betrays it, loses a part of the source. What is lost passes to him completely. There is no going back. A kin does not feel the loss until he measures himself against the stone. Every 3 measures of depth reveal something new to him. That was all. The rule fit into him like a key into a lock and was never repeated. The silence ended. The leaf fell. The wind moved on. Ison stood by the wall, breathing evenly. He picked up a shard of the bowl and looked at the chip. He wasn't thinking of revenge. He was thinking of the tally. His family had lived beside him for 16 years, taking something small from him every day. Food, work, time, dignity. Before, it all vanished into thin air. Now, it had a recipient. The reckoning came quickly. By noon, he was sent to the lower courtyard to clean the stable trough. Desu came there with his 2 friends from the younger branch. Desu had 2 measures and 3 shares, and he considered that great depth. He took the daily ration of flatbread from Ison. He broke it apart and handed it out to his friends. Then he shoved Ison in the chest and said that the far wing existed to serve the upper table. He said this loudly and with relish. Ison sat down in the mud and didn't get up right away. Something clicked inside him, subtle, like the lock on a jewelry box. He felt a sliver of light leave Desu and enter him. Desu didn't notice a thing. Desu wiped his hands and walked away laughing. Ison remained seated, watching his back. He clenched his fist and unclenched it. Then he clenched it again. That evening, they really did leave him without supper. He'd been expecting it. The maid Mir brought him half a loaf of barley bread and hid it under the threshold. She'd been doing this since last winter. She was 20 years younger than his mother and had no one else in this house. He took the bread and remembered. That night, he sat on his cot and placed his palm on his sternum. That was how they taught him to measure depth. One measure, and one more share on top. The light was denser. It was colder and harsher than in the morning. For 8 years, he had grown by one share over an entire season. Today, he received a share for a single push to the chest. He lay down and stared at the dark ceiling. He wasn't counting units. He was counting people. 26 blood-bearers lived in the Hanwol house under this roof. 26 people who did the same thing to him every day. He closed his eyes and, for the first time in 2 lifetimes, fell asleep peacefully. The next morning, his father gathered everyone in the main hall. This happened 3 times a year. Gilsan stood beneath the clan scroll and spoke briefly. He said that the annual measurement would take place in 6 days. He said that this year, it wouldn't just be the elders who would be measured. All the children of the clan, without exception, would be measured. Because in 60 days, enrollment for the Sanctuary of the Branches would open. The orphanage accepted 12 students from each of the 3 valleys. A place at the orphanage meant a name. A name meant alliances. Alliances meant money. The Hanwol house hadn't sent anyone there for 11 years. The hall buzzed with murmurs. Saryan stood at the front, her back straight. Everyone was looking at her. Everyone already knew she would be the first to pass. Her father raised his hand and finished speaking. He said that the clan chief would be coming to Zamer. Grandfather Taegon had not left the upper estate for 4 years. Grandfather possessed 22 measures and could gauge a stranger's origin with the touch of his palm. He stood by the door of the main hall while his relatives dispersed, repeating a single thought to himself. The Zamer stone does not reveal what a person possesses. The stone reveals what a person lets out. He had learned this at 19 from a drunken stonemason at the lower fair. The stonemason was crafting such slabs for 3 houses and laughed at those who trusted them like scales. The slab captures the flow. The slab does not look inside. If a person holds the light pressed against their spine, the slab will show what remains. Back then, that knowledge was useless. Now it was worth 16 years. The first day was spent testing it. He went down to the lower well and placed his palm on his sternum. He pulled the light downward and to the sides, the way one draws water along a groove. At first, nothing happened. The light spread back out. On the 20th try, his head spun and he got a nosebleed. On the 40th, he held onto half of it. He sat on the well's log frame, wiped his face with his sleeve, and tried again. On the second day, he collected debts. He didn't adjust. He simply stopped dodging. Aunt Hyeon ran the pantry and loved the touch of strangers' hands. She sent him to fetch water for Sarion's bath and made him wait outside in the wind for 2 hours so he'd carry the full buckets at the first shout. Inside, something clicked twice. 2 parts of Aunt Hyeon left her and entered him. She wiped her hands and complained aloud that the dampness was making her lower back ache. The third day, Sarion was entertaining friends from the Yosan household. They were led through the garden past the far wing. Sarion stopped and pointed at her brother the way one points at an old outbuilding. She told her guests that he was her youngest and that the family kept him working on the farm. She said this in an even, kind voice. Precisely even, precisely kind. The girls laughed briefly and walked on. There was a deep, Sharp click. 3 shares came out of Sadion at once. He stood there with his rake, watching her back, and understood something important. The system didn't count rudeness. It counted the price. The higher a relative's standing and the calmer he acted, the more expensive a single phrase cost him. The 4th day earned him 2 more shares from Desu and 1 from his younger uncle, who wiped his dirty boot on his shoulder. The 5th day arrived with wind and wet snow. Sogen, the courtyard master, sent the clan's children out to stand at attention. The drill was simple: hold out their arms with 2 wooden planks until the count was reached. The clan's children stood for 40 counts each. Desu held out for 60 and boasted about it. Sogen was a hired hand. He was paid to supervise the older children and had long since stopped paying attention to the far wing. He placed Aisin at the very end of the line for the sake of order. He had no intention of counting him at all. By the 50th count, Aisin's arms were trembling. At the 70th, the planks began to drop, and he raised them back up. By the 100th count, the line had already fallen apart. Desu was sitting on the ground, rubbing his shoulders. Sogen counted to 120 and fell silent. He walked over and circled the boy. He looked not at his hands, but at his knees and his breathing. His breathing was steady and very shallow. That's not how children breathe. That's how people breathe who already know that pain has a bottom. Sogen ordered him to lower the bars. Then he stood there for a long time, looking at the far wing as if he were seeing it for the first time. That evening, he asked Pyong how much younger the branch's youngest son was. Pyong replied, 8. Sogen said nothing and went to his room. For the 6th night in a row, Aisin did not sleep. He sat on the floor, holding the light pressed against his spine until dawn. By morning, his teeth ached, and he could hold everything he had within a single measure. He checked 3 times. His palm on his sternum showed exactly 1 measure. Inside, there were 2 measures and 1 share. In the morning, his grandfather arrived. Taegon entered the courtyard on foot. He left his horses at the lower gate and walked 200 paces through the mud in his white boots, never once glancing at them. He was nearly 70. He was short and gaunt, and everyone stepped aside 3 paces before he approached. 22 measures are not carried with fanfare. They are carried in such a way that it becomes difficult to speak nearby. He climbed onto the platform and sat down. 4 servants carried the stone of Zummer out of the vault. A gray slab as tall as a man laid flat on trestles. The top was polished to a mirror finish. Engraved markings ran along the edge. Gyosan announced the order. First, the older children, then the younger ones, then the adult branches. Sadion stepped forward first. She was dressed in dark blue, and her hair was braided with a silver thread. The courtyard watched her as one watches a festival that repeats every year and never disappoints. In the last measure, she had been 8 measures and 2 parts. Over the course of the year, they had obtained rare herbs from the coast for her and hired a tutor from the Carrion Valley. Her father announced the expectation aloud: 9 measures. She placed her palms on the stone. The slab lit up from within. The light crept upward along the markings. It passed 7 measures quickly. It passed 8 and slowed down. It reached 8 measures and 6 shares, and stopped. The courtyard was silent. The light lingered and then went out. Sadion did not remove her hands. She stared at the markings and did not move. Then she placed her palms on the stone again and pressed down. The slab showed the same result: 8 and 6. 4 parts less than last fall. No less than expected, less than before. Mother rose from the bench and sat back down. Father's expression didn't change, but the knuckles on his hands turned white as he gripped the armrest. Aunt Hyeon quickly remarked that the stone might have gotten damp in storage. Pyung replied in an even voice that the stone had been wiped down before being brought out and tested on 2 servants, and the readings matched the previous ones. Grandfather Taegon said nothing. Next, it was the younger one's turn. Desu stepped forward with confidence and scored exactly 2 measures. He stood on the stone for a few extra moments, waiting for the light to rise higher. The light did not rise. He stepped down from the slab, red-faced and angry. He too had failed. He simply didn't know that last fall he had scored 2 and 3. Then they called for Ison. The courtyard briefly came alive. Measuring the far wing was a formality, and everyone understood that. He climbed onto the platform and placed his palms on the cold stone. He pressed the light against his spine and held it there until his ribs ached. The slab lit up and slowly displayed 1 measure. The light lingered at the first mark and then went out. Gyosan nodded briefly. He said aloud what he had said in his past life. He said that the younger son was empty and fit only for household duties. He said this without malice, just as it is recorded in the inventory. Ison stepped down from the stone and returned to the wall. He stared at the ground and kept his face impassive. Inside, he had 2 measures and 1 share. More than Daesu, more than the 3 adult servants of the clan. The measurement ended by evening. The result was poor. The Hanwal house had lost in the total depth for the first time in 9 years. Gyosan gathered the branches in the small hall and began to search for the cause. The herbalist was blamed. The woman had run the drying shed next to the house for 11 years and went to the coast herself to gather herbs. Gyosan said the herbs had been swapped out or spoiled during transport. He ordered a thorough inspection of the entire drying shed and that her wages be withheld for 3 months. Aunt Ha-yeon immediately added that she had seen the herbalist take money from a stranger's cart driver. She had never seen anything like it before in her life and had made it up on the spot. Everyone agreed quickly. It was easier for everyone to go along with it. Pyung came for him before dawn. The old man didn't say why. He simply told him to wash his hands up to his elbows and follow him. They walked through the sleeping courtyard and went up to the upper chambers, where Ison had never been in his 2 lifetimes. Taegon was sitting on a low bench by the brazier. In front of him stood a board for counting stones. He didn't look up when the boy entered. He told him to sit across from him and hold out his left hand, palm up. Ison sat down and held it out. He managed to do one thing. He pressed the light deeper than he had ever pressed it before, until it hurt beneath his shoulder blades, until he tasted iron in his mouth. Taegon covered his palm with his own. The palm was dry and very warm. The warmth traveled up his arm toward his shoulder and stopped at his collarbone. Ison held on. He stared into the brazier and counted the coals so as not to think about what was happening. Taegon held his hand for a long time, longer than necessary. Then he let go. He said he saw only one solution. He said it slowly. That's how people speak when they're checking their own words for accuracy. Then he asked about the decoction. He asked why the boy had poured the bowl into the tub with the pomegranate. Ison answered as a child would. He said the decoction was bitter and gave him a stomachache. He didn't look up and spoke quietly. Taegon tapped the abacus with his knuckle. He said the pomegranate in the tub had withered overnight. He said the tree had stood there for 9 years and survived 3 droughts. He said he now had 2 explanations. Either the boy had poured poison into it, or the boy had poured out something the tree was unable to tolerate. Ison remained silent. Taegon looked down at him and waited. Then he offered a third possibility. He said that in 40 years as head of the clan, he had seen 11 instances where the clan's vitality had waned. All 11 times, the cause lay within the house. He ordered the boy to leave. At the door, he added one more thing. He said he was leaving Pyong in the lower courtyard until spring, and that Pyong would keep a record of everything that happened to the children of the branch, every day, in writing. Ison stepped out onto the gallery, and only there did he relax his jaw. He walked down the stairs, realizing that the situation had changed. Before, no one had noticed him. Now, the only person in the house capable of measuring with his hand was watching him. He sat down on the bottom step and began counting again. He needed 3 things. He needed a height that couldn't be explained. He needed a witness who would confirm that the boy was simply working, and he needed a way out of the house before his father found a use for him. There were 53 days left until enrollment at the Shelter of Branches. He found a solution that very same day, and he didn't like it. The system paid for usage. That meant he had to let himself be used more and more often, not endure it by accident, endure it on purpose. He went down to the lower courtyard to Master Sogan and asked to be paired with Dez, as a target for practicing strikes. Sogan looked at him and asked if he understood that targets get hit. Ison said he understood. Sogan said they didn't pay or feed him any better for that in the house. Ison said he knew. Sogan was silent for a long time. Then he added him to the list. The days that followed blurred into one. First cut. Morning. The wet sand of the lower courtyard. Dezu practices a straight punch against the soft shield held by Ison. Dezu strikes harder than necessary and aims above the shield. Click! A glancing blow. Another crack after a dozen strikes. Ison stands his ground. He falls 4 times that morning and gets back up 4 times. Second scene. Midway through the training period. Dezu brings 2 friends into the courtyard to show them how he works the far wing. He strikes with a delayed follow-through and splits Ison's lip. His friends laugh. Click, click, click. By evening, Mide brings a cold cloth and cries silently as she applies it. Ison tells her it won't last long. Third cut. Aunt Hyan notices that the boy is now in the courtyard all day and decides he's loafing around. She assigns him night work in the storeroom, to count the sacks and move them away from the wall. He counts them. At the same time, he reads the ledgers that are on the same shelf. He knew how to read them in his past life. He kept those very ledgers for 12 years while his family believed he had no other talents. Fourth scene. Sogan stops using him as a target and begins to have him stand in formation alongside the older ones. He does this in silence. He simply tells Desu one day to find himself another shield. 16 days after his conversation with his grandfather, Sogan spoke aloud what he was thinking for the first time. The clan's children were practicing a 3-step sequence. Desu messed up twice, got angry, and threw the log onto the sand. Sogan picked up the log and said in an even voice that the boy from the far wing's strike lasted longer than that of the heir to the younger branch. He said it wasn't a matter of depth. He said it was because one counted the strikes while the other counted the spectators. He said this in front of all 7 of them. Desu turned pale. Click. 2 beats at once. Sogan looked at Ison, and for the first time, there was no indifference in that gaze. It held the uneasy suspicion of a man who had taught children for 20 years and suddenly saw an adult. That same night, Ison sat on the cot and placed his palm on his sternum. Exactly 3 measures. And then came the second threshold. Silence fell just as it had the first time. The sounds receded. The blood in his ears stopped flowing. Something like a list unfolded inside him. He opened his eyes and looked at the wall. Through the boards, he could see the courtyard. He saw people, not bodies. He saw light. Mide had no light at all. She did not carry Hanwal's blood. She was a warm spot and nothing more. A servant from the younger branch who passed by glowed with 2 measures, and he saw the number as clearly as one sees a notch in a tree. and next to that number hung a second figure. Debt. How much this man already owed him, and how much more he could pay. He stepped out onto the gallery and looked across the courtyard at the main house. Father Gyosan was sitting by the window. 13 measures and 8 shares, not 14. The debt next to him was short, but not empty. Father had already paid. His father paid every time he spoke of household needs. Then he found Sadion's window. 8 measures and 1 share. 5 more shares in 16 days. He stood on the cold veranda and looked at her window for a very long time. He felt no joy. He felt the calm of a man who finally sees the scales with both eyes. He went downstairs, lay down, and fell asleep. The problem arose 2 days later. Sadion checked it herself. She had a homemade testing plate, small, inaccurate, but it showed a difference of 5 shares. Sadion didn't cry and didn't go to her mother. She went to her father and said one word. Cursed. Gyosan didn't believe her at first. He believed her by evening. Because a convenient explanation is always more convincing than an inconvenient one. A curse meant an enemy from outside or a traitor from within. A curse didn't mean that something indescribable was happening to the Hanwol household. The house was shut down. The gates were locked with 2 turns of the bolt. Servants were no longer allowed to leave the estate. Aunt Hyeon was granted the right to search and got into the swing of things within an hour. They turned the drying room upside down. They turned the servants' quarters upside down. They turned the far wing upside down and ripped open Isen's straw mattress. He stood by the wall watching them do it and didn't say a word. There were 4 clicks. By the 3rd day of the searches, the culprit was found. In the maid's quarters, a small bundle was found under a floorboard. Inside the bundle lay a bone with scratched-in markings and a lock of hair tied with a blue thread. The blue thread was from Sadion's sash. The floorboard was under Mide's cot. Aunt Hyeon carried the bundle into the main hall with outstretched arms and spoke loudly and in detail. She said she had noticed it a long time ago, that the girl had been going to the far wing at night, that the girl had been taking food there, that the girl wasn't from around here, had no relatives, and there was no one to ask. Mide knelt in the middle of the hall and repeated that she didn't know where it had come from. No one listened. Gyosan heard the arguments and calmly handed down his decision. 15 lashes in the courtyard in the morning. Then she was to be sold downriver to cover the loss. He said the damage had cost the household 4 shares and that the cost must be reimbursed. Isen stood in the doorway of the hall and saw 2 numbers above Aunt Hyeon, 6 measures and 2 shares. And debt. Her debt was greater than anyone else's in this house. He looked at Meyer. There was nothing above her. No light, no numbers. She didn't carry the blood of Hanwol and had nothing with which to pay him. So he wouldn't get anything out of this either. He turned and went into the storeroom. He took the ledgers from last season off the shelf, sat down on the sacks, and began reading by the light of a single candle. There were 6 hours left until dawn. The candle burned out an hour before dawn, and he finished reading the last few pages by the dim light of the window. There were 3 ledgers, the income ledger, the expense ledger, and a third one that everyone in the house called the travel ledger. The travel ledger recorded everything that came and went with the Carters. Isen knew these ledgers by heart in his past life. He had kept them since he was 17 and silently corrected others' mistakes because the elders would beat him for making corrections. Now he read them not as an accountant. He read them as a hunter reads tracks. He found what he was looking for on the 4th page of the travel ledger. In the morning, they gathered the courtyard early. Meyer was led out to a post by the lower wall. Her hands were tied in front of her. She didn't scream or beg. She stared at the ground and trembled slightly and frequently. Aunt Hyeon stood nearby, a small bundle in her hands, and told those who approached the same story as yesterday, but with new details. Gaeson sat on a bench under the awning. Yeonhee's mother did not come. Sadyeon arrived and stood to her father's left, her expression stern and sad. Grandfather Taegon stood at a distance by a pillar of the gallery and did not sit down. Solgan brought a stick, laid it on the ground, and walked away. He did not like mornings like this. Pyong stood with a writing board and took notes. Isan stepped into the middle of the courtyard with a road book under his arm. The courtyard looked at him and did not understand. An 8-year-old boy from the far wing approached his father's bench and placed the open book on the ground in front of him. He didn't bow or cry. He held the page down with a stone so the wind wouldn't blow it away. Then he spoke very briefly and very clearly. He said that the roll of blue thread had arrived at the house last week. He said that the cart driver had brought the blue thread from the coast on the 11th, along with some dried bark. He said that the travelogue listed 12 skeins of blue thread. He said that the expense ledger listed 11. He said that 1 skein had gone into the storeroom and hadn't left it since. He said that 1 woman kept the storeroom and that 1 woman carried the key to it on her belt. Then he fell silent. The courtyard fell silent along with him. Gyeson leaned over and looked at the page. He was a poor and slow reader and was always self-conscious about it. He looked up at Pyong. Pyong took the book, glanced at both entries, and confirmed in an even voice that there was a discrepancy and that it had not been corrected in either record. Aunt Hayeon laughed and said the child didn't understand what he was reading. She said that bundles were counted by weight, not by number, and that the boy had made it up. Pyong said even more calmly that the bundles in the logbook were counted precisely by number because it was easier that way for the driver. He said he'd been doing it for 40 years. Hayeon fell silent mid-breath. Then she did the worst thing she could have done. She turned to the boy and slapped him across the face with the back of her hand. She screamed that the far wing had completely fallen apart and that the pup was being fed out of charity, yet he was meddling in the affairs of his elders. She screamed long and loud and called him a worthless brat in front of 30 people. Isan fell to one knee and got back up. Blood was running from his nose. He didn't wipe it away. Inside him, something was clicking non-stop. Not in single bursts, in a torrent. He saw the numbers sliding down above his aunt. 6 measures and 2 parts. Exactly 6. 5 and 7. 5 and 4. He stood there, looking into her face, and remained silent. And because of that silence, she screamed even louder and lost her composure even more. Her grandfather stopped her. Taegon stepped forward and said one word. "Quiet." Hayeon faltered and stepped back, then suddenly sat down right on the ground. She clutched her chest, opened her mouth, and couldn't breathe. A person who has lost nearly a measure of light in a single minute sees darkness in their eyes. They carried her away. Mire was untied. She couldn't stand, so the maids led her away. Gyeson announced that the case would be reviewed and that the storeroom would be placed under Pyong's supervision until the end of winter. He did so quickly and curtly because he understood that, in front of outsiders, his branch had just made a poor showing. The courtyard dispersed. Sogan picked up the stick and carried it back to the shed. On the way, he glanced at the boy with blood on his face. He said nothing. He simply looked away first. That evening, Isan stood by the far wall and counted. Aunt Hayeon had given him 11 shares in a single morning, more than the usual amount. For all 40 days before that, he'd been given less. He understood the rule more clearly now. The system didn't pay for pain. The system paid for injustice committed openly and in front of witnesses. The more people who saw it, the more it was worth. He had 4 measures and 3 shares. Mire came to him that night. She sat down on the threshold and was silent for a long time. Then she said she didn't understand why he had done it. He replied that she had been bringing him bread for 8 months and that the account had to balance out on both sides. She began to cry. He told her one thing, and it was the only order he gave all winter. He told her never to bring him food in secret again. He said that what was done in secret could be turned against her, but what was done openly could not. He said that from now on, she would bring food openly on the manager's orders. The next morning, everything changed, not quite as he had expected. Gyesan summoned him to the small hall. Father was sitting at the table, with all 3 books laid out before him. He looked at his son for nearly a minute before speaking. Then he said that the boy read faster than the adult accountants. He said that the family did not squander its talents. He said that the far wing was no longer needed, and that the boy would be moving to the lower rooms of the main house, next to the storeroom. He said that from now on, he would keep the travel ledger under Pyong's supervision. He said this as a favor. Aisin bowed and thanked him. He stepped out onto the gallery, paused, and stood there for a moment, looking out into the courtyard. His father hadn't disowned him. His father had found a use for him. The difference between these 2 things had defined his entire past life. And there was one more difference that he only realized once he was on the stairs. In his past life, he had moved into the main house at 17. Back then, he'd been moved closer to the ritual. The vessel is kept warm and in plain sight. Now he'd been moved there at 8. He'd accelerated not only his own growth, he'd accelerated theirs as well. He entered the new room, closed the door, and sat down on the floor. The room was dry and had a window facing east. He sat there until dark, recalculating the timelines. The second threshold came 11 days after the move. Those days passed in a montage of identical pages and identical mornings. First cut. He keeps a logbook and finds 4 discrepancies in the first week. He corrects 3 of them in silence. He leaves the 4th as is because it incriminates his mother. Second cut. Desu switches from using his fists to something else. He begins calling him a scribe and a calculator in front of the adults, and does so while sitting at the table. He clicks his tongue every time. Desu is at a loss and doesn't understand why standing at attention is becoming harder and harder for him. Third scene. Saryon comes to the storeroom on her own. She brings him a sweet flatbread, speaks affectionately, and asks him to record 2 extra skeins of silk as an expense for her needs. It's the first time in her life she's asked for anything. She approaches him gently and with a smile. Click, 2 shares. He writes it down. He realizes that now she'll be coming even more often. Fourth scene. Every evening, Pyong compiles an inventory for his grandfather, and the boy watches as the old man writes his name in neat handwriting. Taegon reads these sheets in the upper chambers and gives no orders. His grandfather's silence was more frightening than any order. At the 11th night, he had exactly 6 measures, and silence fell for the 3rd time. It was shorter than the previous 2. Inside, it simply became cool and very quiet, and he realized that now the light held on by itself. He no longer needed to press it against his spine until it hurt. The source lay within like water in a sealed jug. Neither a stone nor a palm would now reveal anything beyond what he chose to reveal. He tested his grandfather's palm that morning, both by accident and on purpose. He picked up a counting stone that Taegon had dropped on the floor and placed it in his hand. Their fingers touched for 2 heartbeats. His grandfather didn't notice a thing. By the end of winter, the Hanwol household was in poor shape. Aunt Hyeon was ill and stayed indoors. Desu lost to the 2 younger brothers at the courtyard competition. Sadyeon kept her distance at exactly 8 paces and stopped revealing her depth in front of guests. Kyosan borrowed money from the Yosan household for the spring grain harvest. And then came the day that Ision remembered from his past life. Kyosan gathered the branches in the main hall and announced the roster for recruitment into the shelter of branches. He named two, Saryon from the senior branch and Desu from the junior branch. He said that the house was obligated to send two people and that it could not afford to send more due to travel expenses. Then he looked toward the back of the hall. He said that the travel ledger must be kept by someone who knows how to keep it. He said that the youngest son would travel as a porter and accountant. He said this in the same voice he had used a year ago when discussing household needs. The hall accepted this as a matter of course. Isen stood by the wall, staring at the floor, his expression impassive. Inside, he felt 6 measures and 1 share. More than any other child in this valley. They set out 4 days later. The journey to the shelter of the branches involved 2 passes through mountain saddles and 1 stretch along the river. 3 wagons were traveling. In the first were Saryon and her mother. In the second were Desu and his mentor. The third carried the luggage, and on top of the luggage sat Isen with his travel journal wrapped in an oiled cloth. Grandfather Tegon rode on horseback, staying behind the rest of the group. Kyosan remained at home behind closed gates and locks. The first leg of the journey took place in snow and rain. Isen sat on the sacks, recording expenses for lodging and food, and counting more than just those. He counted the people on the road. For the first time in 2 lifetimes, he saw the world beyond the gates of the Hanwal household, not through the eyes of an adult slave, but through the eyes of someone who still had a choice. The second leg of the journey earned him 4 shares. Desu made him rearrange the luggage twice on a whim. Saryon ordered him to run after the comb left behind at the inn 3 versts back. His mother had told the cart drivers that the boy ate like an adult but carried his load like a child. It clicked every time. By evening on the second day, he had 6 myrrh and 5 shares. The shelter of the branches stood on a flat summit above a bend in the river. It was neither a fortress nor a temple. Long, low buildings made of dark stone and an open square in the middle. 12 old trees with chopped-off tops grew along the perimeter. That's where the name came from. The shelter took in 12, not a single one more. There were about 200 visitors. The houses from the 3 valleys had brought their best, and these best stood in the square in their finest clothes, sizing each other up with their eyes. The shelter's mentor announced the selection procedure. Master Yoran, an elderly man dressed in gray with a scorched left cheek and a very calm voice. He said the selection would take place in 3 rounds, and that each round would eliminate half the contestants. The first round was an endurance test. The second was arithmetic and memory. The third was the measurement on the orphanage's large stone. He said there were 12 spots available. He said that only the 3rd round would determine the final outcome, and that one still had to make it to the 3rd round. He said that those who had sent their candidates from home had no right to interfere, and that anyone who violated this rule would have to take all their candidates back home. Desu passed the first round. He stood for 64 counts and fell in 18th place out of the 112 who passed. Saryon passed easily. The second round was on counting. The students were given a sequence of numbers and items and asked to balance the accounts. Desu sat in the middle of the hall and, after a minute, stopped understanding what was going on. He was eliminated after the second round. He went out into the square and shouted that accounting wasn't a warrior's business and that he'd been humiliated on purpose. He was shouting in front of 300 people. He didn't know he was shouting in the presence of his own counter. Click! 3 points at once. Desu sat down on a rock, clutched his temples, and sat there until dark. Saryon barely made it through the second round. She had been taught to fight and keep her composure. She hadn't been taught to count. She ranked 62nd out of 65. The third round was scheduled for the morning. That night, in the designated rooms, something happened that decided everything. Yunhee's mother counted on her fingers, but the numbers didn't add up. The shelter had 12 spots. Her mother knew the household quota. She knew her daughter had exactly 8 measures and that it might not be enough. The Hanwol house arrived with 2 and was left with 1. One girl, 8 measures tall, against the other houses that had brought their best. And then she remembered the rule that no one had read aloud. A house earned the right to a second spot if it put 2 on the stone. Not 2 who had passed, 2 who had been nominated. The second contestant could demonstrate any level of depth. The second simply had to step onto the stone. She went to her grandfather. Taegon listened but didn't reply. She went to Pyong. Pyong said that this was exactly how it was written in the shelter's rules and that the clarification had been added 9 years ago. Then her mother came into the room where the porter was sleeping. She woke him up and said what she had to say. She said that in the morning he would stand on the stone alongside his sister. She said that nothing was required of him. She said that he just had to stand there and that his score didn't matter at all. She said he would go home that very same day. She said this hurriedly and irritably, and at the end added that even an empty one would do when a spot needed to be filled. She used him directly, out loud, and without a shred of doubt. There was a dull, heavy click. 4 fragments came out of the mother at once. She staggered at the threshold, grabbed the doorframe, and said it was stuffy in there. Eisen sat down on the cot and stared at the closed door, remaining motionless for a long time. He hadn't expected this. He had planned to go home as a porter and search for another path for 3 years. In the morning, a large shelter stone was placed in the square. It was twice as wide as the one at home, and markings running along its edge went up to 30 meters. They were selecting the last ones. Those who had passed the second round approached one by one, placed their palms on the stone, and the square called out the numbers aloud. The passing threshold held steady at 6 meters and rose. Sarion was 8th. She placed her palms on the stone, and the light rose steadily and confidently, stopping at 8 meters and 1 share. The square hummed approvingly. Yoran recorded the result. 8th depth out of 65. 23rd place on the overall list of participants. She stepped down from the stone, pale. She hadn't taken first place. In fact, she hadn't placed at all except for a spot in the top 12. Then they called up the second contestant from the Hanwol household. His mother pushed him forward with her hand on his back. She did this in full view of the square and added quietly that the boy was from the household staff. 2 more shares. Eisen climbed onto the platform. He walked slowly because he was counting. He saw the numbers above everyone standing there. He saw that 12th place on the list was currently held at 7 measures and 3 shares. He saw that 2 others were standing behind him with 7 measures, and that if he showed exactly 7 and 4, he would take 12th place. And he saw his grandfather. Taegon was standing by the tree at the far end, staring intently at the stone. If he showed too much, his grandfather would understand everything in that very moment. If he showed too little, he would go home in a cart and die 16 years later on a cold stove. He placed his palms on the stone. He opened it exactly as much as he had decided. The light shot upward. He passed 6 measures, and the square fell silent. He passed 7, and his mother fell silent. He stopped at 7 measures and 4 parts. The silence lingered for a long time. Then the square spoke all at once. Sarion turned and looked at her brother, and her face took on a childlike expression out of bewilderment. She was 5 years older. She was standing at 8 measures and 1 part. He was standing at 7 and 4 at the age of 8. The distance between them was 7 parts. A year ago, it had been 8 measures. Master Yorin approached the stone himself. He didn't bother to measure again. He looked not at the markings, but at the boy. He watched as the child stood on the platform before 300 strangers. His shoulders were slumped. His breathing was shallow. His gaze was fixed not on the audience, but on the list. Yorin had been teaching children for 26 years and knew what a gifted child looked like and what a child who had accidentally scored high looked like. This one looked neither one nor the other. This one looked like someone who had stepped onto the stone already knowing the number he would show. Yorin asked him in front of everyone how old he was. Aizen replied that he was 8. Yorin paused, then said aloud what he would have said later in private. He said that what he looked for in the 12th spot was not depth, but calculation. He said that depth could be cultivated with herbs and money. He said that calculation could not be cultivated. He wrote the name at the bottom of the list and announced that the selection was complete. The Hanwal house received 2 spots out of 12. This hadn't happened in 11 years. The ride back was different.
Saryan was silent the whole way and never once looked toward the third wagon. Her mother clutched her chest and said she'd caught a cold in the square. Desu walked part of the way behind them because he was too angry to sit still. As for Isan, he sat on the sacks with his travel journal and realized that this victory had cost him more than anything he'd ever experienced before. Grandfather Tegon caught up with the third wagon on the second day of the journey. He walked alongside it at a leisurely pace and remained silent for a long time. Then he said he had seen a stone. He said that in 6 months, 1 measure turns into 7 in only 3 cases. A legacy that awakens late, a secret teaching from an outside source, or light coming from another bearer. He named all 3 and glanced sideways at his grandson. Isan stared at the road and said nothing. Then Tegon spoke the most important part. He said that upon returning home, he would summon the entire clan. He said that in half a year, the house had lost nearly 2 measures of collective depth and gained 7 in a single child. He said that the clan would not try to figure out where it came from. The clan would simply gather it all in one place. He said that the rite of knowledge had been performed on bearers who had reached the age of 24 because, before that, the vessel could not hold enough. He said that now there was no point in waiting until 24. He said he would schedule the rite for the 16th year. He said this without malice and without threat. He said it like the head of the clan announcing the harvest season. Then he spurred his horse and rode ahead. Isan sat on the sacks and watched his back. 8 years behind him. 8 years ahead. He had 7 measures and 4 shares, a place in the shelter of branches, and not a single ally with Hanwal blood. And at the upper estate, a man with 22 measures was already waiting for him, a man who knew how to measure with his palm, and who had just named the day of his second death. The carriages entered the gates of the Hanwal household in the evening of the 4th day. The courtyard had been tidied up, the paved path swept clean, and the entire clan was gathered at the bottom steps. Gyosan stepped out first. He had been expecting 1 piece of news, but received 2. The coachman had already told him the first piece of news at the lower gate. The Hanwal household had secured 2 of the 12 spots. Upon hearing this, his father sat up straight, and for the first time that winter, his face took on the expression of a living person. His wife brought him the second piece of news. She stepped down from the cart, walked past her husband without greeting him, and said only that the boy had measured 7 paces and 4 parts. Kyosan didn't understand at first. He asked her to repeat it twice. Then he looked across the courtyard to where his youngest son was unloading sacks from the 3rd cart and stacking them against the wall. The boy worked as he always did, steady, silent,
without looking up. His father watched him for a very long time. He didn't approach him or say a word. That night, no one slept in the main house. Ison heard voices through 2 walls. He lay in his room next to the storeroom and analyzed their intonations the way one analyzes footprints. His mother spoke quickly and in a high-pitched voice. His father replied briefly. Once, something fell and rolled away. He knew this conversation by heart, even though he was hearing it for the first time. In a past life, they'd led him to it at 17, at 20, and at 23. The conversation was always the same. In it, they decided not what to do with their son, but when. In the morning, he was summoned to the small hall. Kyo-san was sitting at the table and a logbook lay before him. He opened it and ran his finger down a column. He said the entries were kept neatly and that there were no discrepancies. Then he closed the book and asked about the stone. He asked directly, "Where did the 7 measures come from?" Ison answered like a child. He said he had stood in the courtyard with Master Sogan all winter. He said he had held the stance every day. He said he didn't know how depth was measured and that he had simply placed his hands as instructed. He spoke quietly and stumbled over his words in the right places. Kyo-san listened and nodded, and it was clear that he had already accepted the explanation that suited him. The convenient explanation went like this. A late talent had emerged in the branch. This talent had been awakened by hard work and deprivation. So deprivation had been useful. So his father had done everything right. He told his son that the distant wing had tempered him and that the clan had not erred in its order. He said this with complete conviction. Something clicked quietly. 1 share. Ison bowed his head even lower and thanked him for the lesson. Then the changes began, and they came quickly. First cut. He is moved from the room next to the storeroom to the upper chambers of the east wing, a room with 2 windows and a brazier. The very same one where Desu had lived in his past life. Second scene. For the first time in 8 years, Yunhee's mother comes to see him herself. She brings a fur-lined winter dress and says that the boy has grown and that it would be a shame to send the family name to the orphanage in rags. She strokes his hair, her hand dry and gentle. It's the way you'd pet a stranger's dog. Third scene. He's seated at the 6th place at the table, not the last. He eats meat for the 2nd time in his life. Fourth scene. Aunt Hayeon comes out of her room for the first time in a month and silently sets a cup of sweet broth in front of him before leaving without looking back. Fifth scene. Desu stops talking to him altogether. He walks around him in a wide arc and looks away. Over the course of 14 days, the Hanwol household's attitude toward their youngest son has changed completely. And this turned out to be worse than anything that had come before. Before, they took things from him, and that cost them their shares. Now, they gave him things. The system paid nothing for gifts, nor for a kind word. In 14 days, Isen received a total of 3 shares. 1 from his father for his studies, 1 from Desu, who, in a fit of anger, had told the servants that the scribe had been taken upstairs for his beautiful handwriting, and 1 from his mother, who, in front of guests from the Yosan household, said she had invested a great deal of effort in her youngest son, and that this effort had now borne fruit. He sat by the window that evening, counting and coming to terms with a new reality. The household had stopped exploiting him openly. The household had begun to protect him. They don't protect a person. They protect a reserve. He could see it in the numbers. 13 measures and 7 shares hung over his father, and his debt was small. Over Sarion hung 8 measures and 1 share, and her debt, on the contrary, had grown. She began to think of him often and to think badly of him, and because of this, her debt swelled but did not spill over because she remained silent. The system paid only for what was spoken and done. Thoughts were worth nothing. 18 days later, the grandfather summoned the clan. All 3 branches gathered.
26 bloodline bearers and 9 more distant relatives whom Ison was seeing for the first time. The main hall was so packed that people were standing against the walls. Taegon sat beneath the ancestral scroll and spoke briefly. He named 2 figures. The first. Over the past 6 months, the household's total depth had fallen by 1 measure and 8 shares. He listed by name who had lost what. Aunt Haeon had lost nearly 1 measure. Sadion, 9 shares. Desu, 6. Yeonhee, 6. Kyosang, 3. And 11 others, 1 or 2 each. The hall listened in complete silence. Until that day, everyone had known only their own loss, and everyone had considered it a coincidence. The second figure. Over the same 6 months, 1 child of the branch had risen from 1 measure to just over 7. Taegon said he would not attempt to explain the coincidence and that the clan would not seek to blame anyone because there was no one to blame. He said the clan would act differently. He announced his decision. The right of knowledge for the youngest son of the senior branch would take place in his 16th year. He said that the depth gathered in a single vessel must return to the clan's pillar. He named the pillar. The pillar was Sadion. The hall exhaled and hummed in approval. No one objected. No one even glanced at the boy standing by the eastern wall. The rite of initiation was not considered murder. The rite was regarded as the younger's duty to the elder and was recorded in the clan's genealogical records as a merit. Ison stood by the wall, staring at the floor. He had been expecting this ever since his return journey, and yet what he heard still weighed heavily on him. 8 years old. Not 16. 8. And then a man he hadn't expected stood up. Master Sogan stepped out of the ranks of the mercenaries and asked to speak. Mercenaries weren't usually allowed to speak in the clan hall, but Taegon nodded. Sogan spoke briefly and awkwardly because he wasn't used to speaking in such halls. He said he'd been teaching the boy all winter. He said the boy had stood at attention while the adults sat down. He said he didn't understand how they could take from a child what he had earned through hard work. He said that if the clan acted this way, the clan was cutting off its own legs. He fell silent and sat down, his ears burning. The hall was silent. Gyosan stood up and said that a hired hand didn't understand clan affairs and that such words warranted punishment. He called Sogan an outsider who was meddling in family affairs. He said this loudly, in front of everyone. Sogan stood up and walked out of the hall without looking back. By evening, he had packed his things. Ison found him at the lower gate. The master was saddling his mule and didn't look at the boy. He said he was a fool and that he'd kept his mouth shut for 20 years and should have kept it shut. He said he would now go to the Yosan household or further down the river, where they always needed people who could hold their ground. He said one last thing. He said the boy could take a beating better than anyone he'd ever seen, but that it wouldn't mean a thing if the blows weren't aimed at his face. He rode off into the darkness. Ison stood by the gate until the sound of hooves faded away. He didn't receive a single share for that day's work. Sogan did not carry the blood of Hanwol. He was an outsider, and his protection cost Ison nothing and gave him nothing. It simply existed. He returned to his room and sat on the floor, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, he found it hard to count. He sat there until midnight, recalculating the timeline all over again. 8 years until the rite. 3 years at the orphanage until the first graduation circle. 12 students, of whom he was last in depth and first in age from the bottom. And 1 way. The way was simple and, for that very reason, despicable. At home, they would no longer humiliate him openly. At home, they would feed him, protect him, and nurture him as one nurtures grain for sowing. That meant the shares would stop coming.
That meant he would grow only where no one cherished him. That meant the orphanage. At the orphanage, there were 11 strangers' children from strangers' homes, and not a single one of them carried Hanvul blood. Not a single one of them would pay him a share. He understood what the trap was. The system had fed him only through his clan, and now the clan had hidden its hands behind its back. 2 days before his departure, something happened that turned the tables. Sadian came to him on her own. She walked in without knocking, sat down across from him, and remained silent for a long time. Then she spoke very calmly. She said she knew he had heard his grandfather's will. She said she hadn't asked for this. She said the right wasn't her choice but the clan's tradition. She said she would take care of him for these 8 years and that he would want for nothing. She spoke sincerely. That was the worst part. She truly believed it. Then she said one last thing. She said he was lucky to have been born into a family where his life had value and meaning. She said that many people die for nothing. Something clicked deep inside him. 3 beats. She stood up and walked out. At the door, she staggered slightly and held onto the doorframe. Ison sat motionless, watching her go. He understood the most important thing about his sister. She would never stay silent. She would explain to him why his death was right. Every time she felt restless, she would come and say it out loud. And every time, she would pay the price. He lay down and fell asleep almost immediately. In the morning, a carriage came to take him to the orphanage. His mother came out to see him off, adjusted his collar, and said in front of the servants that the family had high hopes for him. 1 share. His father did not come out. His grandfather stood on the upper gallery, looking down, and did not move. Ison got into the carriage and it set off. He had 7 measures and 9 shares. Beyond the gates, 3 years awaited him among strangers' children who owed him nothing. The wagon reached the flat summit around noon. The shelter of branches greeted him with an empty courtyard and wet stone. Master Yoren welcomed the students without a word. He outlined the daily schedule and led them on a tour of the buildings. The 12 students were housed in a single long building, 2 to a room. Ison was assigned a corner by the north wall and a roommate named Tamun from the Soren house in the lower valley. Tamun was 13 years old, measured 9 measures and 2 shares, and was 3rd on the list. He looked at his 8-year-old roommate and asked if there had been a mistake in the room assignments. Then he silently moved his belongings to the farthest bunk and didn't speak to him at all for 3 days. The first cycle of training was called Gathering. Yoren explained it that very first morning. He said that the source is not a force. He said that the source is a capacity. He said that 12 measures in a person who cannot channel them outward are worth less than 4 measures in someone who can. He demonstrated this in the square. He placed a bowl of water on a rock 20 paces away and stood still, and the bowl split in half. He said he had 14 measures and that 20 years ago he had channeled half as much at the same depth. Then came days that blurred into one. First scene, morning. 12 students in the square channel light into their palms and hold it until the count is reached. Most succeed on the 3rd day. Ison succeeds on the 2nd day, but he claims to have done it on the 6th so as not to be at the top of the list. Second assessment, the counting hall. Yoren gives problems testing balance and memory. Here, Ison doesn't hide. There's no need to hide here, and here he is first among the 12 from the very first day. Tamun looks at him across the table and speaks to him for the first time. He asks where the boy learned to count. Ison replies that he kept a travelogue at home. Tamun says that in his household, a 40-year-old man keeps the travelogue. Third scene, evening drill. The 12 are holding the bars. Ison outlasts everyone and collapses last, and Yoren writes this down in her notebook every time without saying a word. Fourth scene, the communal table. 11 students from the 7 houses discuss whose branches are stronger and whose are weaker. Ison eats in silence, listening and memorizing names. Fifth cut, night. He sits on a cot with his palm pressed against his sternum. 7 measures and 9 parts. In 20 days, 7 measures and 9 parts. In 40 days, 7 measures and 9 parts. Not a single new one. The trap worked exactly as he had calculated. The shelter gave him nothing. 11 other children could beat him or laugh at him or force him to carry their belongings, and it wouldn't cost them a single share. Convol's blood remained behind the saddle, 2 crossings from here. He was now growing only in the way everyone grows, through labor. And it was slow. In 40 days, an average student at the orphanage would gain 1 or 2 shares. Ison gained 0 because he was expending energy to keep his depth hidden and not stand out. He realized this on the 41st day and sat by the window all night. He weighed his options, and they all led to the same place. He needed kin. He needed Hanwol blood carriers close to him and in a position where they would use him. The house had taken that opportunity away from him when it decided to protect him. So he had to get it back. That meant he had to make sure the house started taking again. He found the solution 7 days later, and it came from an outside source. The board of trustees arrived at the orphanage. 3 times a year, the orphanage showcased its students to those who paid for its upkeep. The heads of the houses and the elders of the branches would come and watch how their children were being taught. Gyesan arrived from the Hanwol house. He brought Sadyeon with him because she had studied at the orphanage alongside her brother and lived in the girls' dormitory. He brought one more person with him. He brought Dae-soo. Dae-soo had failed the selection process and stayed home, spending the entire fall listening to people in the household talk about the 2 spots out of 12. His father took him along to show him what he had missed out on and to spur him on. It was a mistake. 3 Hanwol blood carriers entered the orphanage courtyard on the same day, and Isen stood in the general ranks watching them and counting. The demonstration proceeded as usual. The students projected light into their palms, the students held their stances, the students solved arithmetic problems aloud. Kyo-san sat among the trustees, keeping a neutral expression. Sadyeon stepped forward third, summoned the light well, and received a murmur of approval. Then Isen stepped forward. He summoned the light into his palm as he'd been taught, held it until the count was finished, and did not display it any longer. Yoran called his name and announced his place on the list. 12th in depth, 1st in counting and memory. One of the trustees asked how old the boy was. Yeran replied that he was 9. A murmur rippled through the hall. And then Kyesan stood up. He rose on his own and spoke before the 17 trustees from the 6 houses. He said he was pleased to hear the praise. He said that the Hanwol house had invested a great deal in their youngest son. He said that the boy had been taught arithmetic at home and that the house had been preparing him for service on the estate from an early age. He said that the family saw his future in assisting his older sister, who was the true pillar of the branch. He said this proudly and affectionately and with complete sincerity. He announced to strangers that his son was an asset to his daughter. There was a double click, then another. 3 shares for a single speech. Kyesan sat down, reached for his collar, and unbuttoned the top button. He felt stifled. Dae-soo stood at the edge of the platform and listened as they praised the very person he'd been chasing around the lower courtyard for a year. He couldn't take it anymore. After the demonstration in the courtyard in front of a dozen students, he walked up and said loudly that the scribe had remained a scribe even at the orphanage, and that one could carry other people's books without any depth of character. He also said that his spot in the 12th class had been bought for him. He said this in front of other children from other homes. Click, click, 2 strokes. Tamun stood nearby and heard everything. He looked at Desu with cold surprise. He didn't stand up for him. He simply turned away and left, and that was worse than any words. That evening, Saryeon found her brother by the eastern wall. She sat down beside him and said that their father was proud of him. She said she'd seen him bring out the light and that it was impressive for a man his age. Then she said the most important thing. She said she was glad they were both here and that in 3 years they would return home together. She said it would be easier for her to bear the burden knowing there was someone nearby she could lean on. She said it warmly. She was referring to the right. She herself didn't realize how it had sounded. Click, 2 shares. She got up and left, then stopped on the steps and stood there, holding onto the railing. In a single day since his relative's arrival, Ison had received 7 shares, more than in all the 47 days before that. He sat in the square in the dark and realized he'd found his way. The method was despicable, and he accepted it. He needed his family to visit. He needed his family to talk about him in front of strangers. He needed the Hanwol household to boast about him openly and explain to everyone what place he held. Pride expressed in front of witnesses was worth exactly as much as a beating. All that remained was to make sure they visited more often and talked more. He began that very night. He wrote a letter home. In the letter, he thanked his father for his education and asked permission to send statements from the orphanage's ledgers so that his family could see where the money for his upkeep was going. He wrote in the handwriting of a diligent child and made 2 mistakes per page. His father replied 9 days later and gave his permission. This marked the beginning of a correspondence that lasted 3 years. From there, time is shown in flashbacks. First flashback. The first winter. Ison is ranked 12th in depth and 1st in order.
Yuran asks him 3 times in private if he wants to take the general measurement test out of turn. Isyeon refuses each time and explains that he isn't ready. Yuran doesn't press the issue and records his refusal in her notebook. Second flashback. Spring. Tamun breaks his arm on a post and can't write for a month, so Isyeon takes his notes. After that, Tamun starts calling him by his first name. He's the first person at the shelter to do so. Third flashback. The Guardian's second visit. Kyesan again mentions his younger son in front of strangers and once more refers to him as his older sister's help. 4 shares for the day. Fourth flashback. Summer. A letter arrives from home in which his mother writes that the family is proud of both children and that she is waiting for the pillar to return. The words are worthless. The system pays only for what is said in public and what is done. Fifth segment. The second year. Isen moves up to 10th place in depth because he can't hide any further without arousing suspicion. He shows exactly 9 measures. He actually has 12 measures and 3 shares. Over the 2 years at the shelter, he earned 2 measures from the shelter through labor and nearly 2 measures from his family for their 4 visits. Toward the end of the second year, something happened that threw his calculations off. Yuran summoned him to his room one evening and told him that the Hanwol household had sent a petition. The household requested that their youngest son be transferred to a reduced term and returned home in 1 year instead of 3. They cited the need for a farmhand on the property. Yuran looked at him and waited for an answer. Then he added one more thing. He said he had seen many children who were taken home early. He said they didn't take those who weren't up to the task. They took those who were needed at home for some other purpose. He didn't reply to Yuran that evening. He asked for a day to think it over, and Yuran gave him 3. He went out to the square, sat down under the tree on the far end that had been cut down, and stayed there until dawn. His request meant one thing. Something had changed at home, and it hadn't changed in his favor. He ran through the possible reasons and settled on the simplest one.
Money. The Hanwal household had borrowed from the Yosan household for the spring harvest 2 years ago and had borrowed twice more since then. He knew this because he'd been corresponding with his father and had asked him to send him bank statements, ostensibly for his education. His father had sent them. His father was proud that his son was learning about managing a household. In the statements, Isen saw something his father hadn't noticed.
Dom Hanvil was paying the orphanage for 2 students. The fee for 1 student was 18 silver coins a year. For 2, 36. The branch's annual income after loans was about 200. A fifth of that went to the orphanage. The household managed to keep this up for 2 years, but couldn't make it through a third. They didn't want to take him away. They wanted to cut their expenses in half. And the choice between a son and a daughter had been made all on its own, even before anyone sat down to discuss it. He returned to Yorin on the 3rd day and said he was asking to be allowed to stay. Yorin asked on what grounds. The apprentice had no right to object to the house. Eisen replied that he was offering the orphanage a deal. He said he would take charge of the orphanage's ledgers, all 3, the income, expense, and travel ledgers. He said he would keep them free of charge in lieu of his keep. Yorin was silent for a long time. The shelter employed a single bookkeeper on a salary of 24 silver pieces a year, and this bookkeeper was old and had been mixing up the columns for the 3rd year in a row. Yorin said the student was 9 years old. Eisen placed a sheet of paper on the table. The sheet summarized all of the shelter's expenses for the previous fall, pointing out 4 places where the figures didn't add up. He had compiled it in 2 nights using the statements that Yorin himself had given to the students as practice problems. Yorin read the sheet twice. Then he asked why the boy needed to stay so badly. Eisen told the truth, and it was the only time in 3 years that he had told an adult the truth. He said that at home, they wouldn't let him grow up. Yorin looked at him and asked no further questions. He wrote a reply to the Hanwal household. In the reply, he stated that the orphanage was exempting the youngest son of the senior branch from paying board in exchange for the work he performed. The house got what it wanted. The house stopped paying for 1 person. The house didn't understand a thing. The petition was withdrawn that same month. This marked the beginning of the 2nd half of his term, and it proceeded in stages. The first stage. He keeps the orphanage's 3 ledgers and now knows everything. Which houses pay on time, which are late, and which trustees are on whose side. The Yosan house pays for 3 children and pays first. The Soren house pays for 2 and is late. The Hanwal house hasn't paid at all since last fall. Second insight. He uses the ledgers differently than an accountant would. He sees how much each house spends on herbs and tutors for their children, and based on these expenses, he gauges others' true depth more accurately than the measurements reveal. Third insight. Tamun brings him a letter from the house and asks for help sorting out the bill. The House of Soren has been cheated on grain deliveries for 3 years. Eisen uncovers the fraud within an hour. Tamun writes home, and the fraud is stopped. From that day on, Tamun follows him as one would follow an elder, even though he is 4 years older. Fourth scene. The Guardians arrive. Gyosan does not come. His mother arrives. In front of strangers, she says that the family is grateful to the younger son for his diligence and that she is waiting for him to return and become a pillar of support. 2 shares. Fifth segment. In her 3rd year, Sadyeon takes the general measurement test and measures 8 measures and 6 shares, exactly the same as 2.5 years ago at home. She hasn't grown even by a fraction. The orphanage notices this. Yeran writes in a report to the trustees that the student from the Hanwal house has shown no growth for the 3rd year in a row and that the reason is unclear. 17 houses read the report. Sadyeon finds out about this and locks herself in her room in the girls' dormitory for 2 days. On the 3rd day, she goes to see her brother. It was the most heartfelt conversation of all. She came at night, sat down on his cot, and began speaking without preamble. She said she didn't understand what was happening to her. She said she was doing everything she'd always done and that her depth remained the same. She said that back home they'd told her she was the pride of the 3 valleys, but here she was 8th out of 12. She spoke at length and incoherently, and for the first time there was sincerity in her voice. Aisin listened in silence. Then she said what she had come to say. She said she was afraid she wouldn't grow tall enough by the time he turned 16. She said that if, by the time of the rite, she stood at 8 measures tall, the clan would consider the investment a failure and change their patron. She said that then everything he was saving up for her would be wasted. She said this to his face, to his 9-year-old brother. She explained to him that she wasn't afraid for him, but for the success of his assassination. Something clicked so hard that the back of his head rang. 4 shares at once. Serion turned pale, clutched her chest, and fell onto her side. He called for the female dormitory's mentors, and they carried her away. She didn't get up for 3 days. The physician said the girl was exhausted from her studies. Yuran wrote this down in his notebook. And then came the 3rd threshold. It came to him in his 9th year, on the night after his sister was carried away. He was sitting on the floor of his room, and inside him there were exactly 15 measures. Silence unfolded, and this time it showed him neither rules nor a list. It showed him blood. He saw his entire lineage, not faces, a network. 26 bearers under the roof of the Hanwol house and 9 more among his distant kin, and they all hung in this web like knots, with a thread stretching from each one to him. Some threads were thin and almost empty. Others were thick. The thickest one came from Serion. He could see each of them, no matter where they were. He saw grandfather Tegon at the upper estate, 21 measures and 8 parts. Grandfather, too, was losing a little at a time and didn't understand why. He saw his father, 13 and 2. He saw Desu, 1 measure and 7 parts. Desu had fallen lower than he had been at age 8. And he saw one more. He saw that the thread leading from himself extended somewhere beyond the network, beyond its edge, to a place he didn't know. He stared at that thread for a very long time. Then the silence ended. In the morning, he went to the accounting hall and opened the shelter's ledger, covering all 12 years it had been kept. He searched for any mention of the Hanwol house in the records of others. He found what he was looking for by the evening of the 3rd day. 11 years ago, the Hanwol house had sent a student to the orphanage. The student had studied there for less than a year and was recalled. The book listed a name, Hegel, and there was a note from the treasurer regarding the refund of part of the tuition due to the student's withdrawal following his death. He had never heard that name before. There was no Hegel at the Hanwol house, nor was he ever mentioned there. There was no grave. There was no memorial plaque in the ancestral hall. 11 years ago, Aizen had not yet been born. He sat poring over the book by candlelight, calculating the dates. 11 years ago, Serion was 2 years old. Even then, she was already being groomed to be a pillar of the house. And one student from the House of Hanwol had died at the orphanage before completing a full year of study. He closed the book and realized he had found the first one. He wasn't the first Messel. He was the second. He had searched for 3 months and found almost nothing. In the orphanage's records, Hegel's name appeared 4 times, an admission record, 2 payment receipts, and a note regarding the refund of fees following his death. No age was listed. No branch was listed. No cause of death was listed. He asked Yorin directly. Yorin looked at him intently and said he didn't remember. He said that 11 years ago, he wasn't yet a senior mentor.
He also said that if a student died at the orphanage, a report had to be filed with the trustees, and that the reports were kept in the lower archive. He gave him the key. He gave the key to a 9-year-old boy, and he did so in silence, which meant more than any words could. The archive was damp, and it held bundles dating back 20 years. Eisen searched for 4 nights. There was no report for that year. There was an inventory of the bundles, and the student was listed in it. There was a bundle. The bundle was empty. Someone had taken out the report and left the wrapper behind so the inventory would match. He sat on the floor of the archive with the empty wrapper in his hands and counted again. Whoever had taken out the report had access to the shelter's archive. That meant it was someone from the shelter or a trustee. That meant the Hanwell house hadn't simply buried the student. The Hanwell house had paid for silence. He returned the key to Yorin and said he hadn't found it. Yorin wasn't surprised. He merely noted that there were 3 empty bundles in his archive and that the other 2 were also about death. Next came the orphanage's 3rd year, and he went through it in segments. First snapshot. Eisen enters the general measurement and scores 11 points. He rises to 5th place out of 12. At age 10, 5th place out of 12 was unprecedented, and the orphanage has been talking about it for 2 months. He's doing this on purpose. He needs publicity. Second snapshot. The publicity is working. 3 houses send cautious letters to the orphanage asking about the youngest son of the Hanwell house. The Yosan house asks if the boy is engaged. Eisen is the first to see these letters because he keeps the records. He cannot reply, but he knows. Third scene.
Jaesan learns about the 5th position and comes in person for the first time in a year and a half. He brings gifts and speaks at length and eloquently in front of the trustees. He says the family has always believed. He says the youngest son will be a reliable pillar of support for his older sister, and that this support is now stronger than ever. He repeats the word support 11 times in front of 17 strangers. 6 shares in a single day. Joseon leaves, and on the way he becomes ill and is carried the last stretch while lying down. Fourth scene. Tamun is released and leaves for Soran's house. Before leaving, he tells Eisen that if he ever needs a place to stay for a while, the lower valley is spacious. He says this awkwardly and quickly, and leaves without looking back. Fifth scene. Sadion is released that same year. She leaves the orphanage with 8 measures and 6 shares, exactly the same as when she entered. The orphanage writes the word stagnation on her graduation certificate. With this certificate, she returns home. Eisen returned home a year after her. He was 11 years old. He left the orphanage ranked 2nd out of 12 in depth, and 1st in both calculation and memory for all 3 years. 13 measures were demonstrated, 17 full ones and 4 fractions. The Hanwell household welcomed him differently than they had seen him off. The gates were open, and the entire family was standing in the courtyard. His father stepped forward, placed a hand on his shoulder, and held it there while the servants unloaded the wagon. His mother was crying. Aunt Hyeon bowed. Desu stood in the back row, staring at the ground. Over the past 3 years, the household had changed, and for the worse. Eisen saw this within the first hour. The roof of the east wing was patched with shingles. Half the horses had been sold. Of the 26 servants under the roof, 19 remained. 7 had broken away and gone to live in the younger branch's houses because the senior branch had stopped providing for them. The debt to the Yosan household had grown to 440 in silver. And he saw the figures. His father, 12 measures and 1 share. His mother, 4 and 6. Grandfather, 23. Desu, 1 and 1. Sadion, 8 measures and 6 shares. In 3 years, her share hadn't changed by even a fraction, neither up nor down, because she was far away and said nothing about him. But the rest of the household had fallen behind.
That evening, there was a family dinner. Gyosan spoke in front of everyone about the branch's future. He said that in 5 years, the clan would rise again. He said that to achieve this, they only needed to see the matter through to the end. He did not name the matter aloud in front of the servants, but everyone at the table understood. Ison sat in the third seat, eating and counting. That night, his grandfather came to him. Taegon had not gone up to the East Wing even once in 11 years. He entered without knocking, sat down on the bench by the window, and said he wanted to measure. He held out his hand. Ison offered his own and extended it exactly 13 measures. Taegon held it for a long time. Then he withdrew his hand and said he saw 13. Then he said that the first time he had seen 1, and that he had been mistaken then. He said that in 43 years of leadership, he had been wrong twice, and both times in this house. He looked out the window and spoke slowly. He said that the clan was dying. He said he could see it in the numbers better than anyone else. He said the house was losing 1 measure a year, that there was no reason for it, and that he had searched for the reason for 4 years and found nothing. Then he asked about Hegel. He asked directly. He asked if his grandson knew that name and where it came from. Ison replied that he had found it in the shelter's books. Taegon nodded the way one nods when a long-held suspicion is confirmed, and he told the story himself. He said that Hegel was his youngest son by his second wife. He said the boy was 9 years old and had a depth of 11 mer at the age of 9. He said the clan had to decide at that time who would be their pillar of support. 2-year-old Saryeon with her rare height, or 9-year-old Hegel with his established depth. He said they chose Saryeon because she was from the senior branch, while Hegel was from his second wife. He said that Hegel was sent to the orphanage so he could be kept under watch and grow to the required height. He said that less than a year later, a letter arrived reporting his death from a fever. He said that the body was not brought back. He said that he personally paid the orphanage to keep quiet. He said that he didn't want the clan to know that a pillar had been chosen. He fell silent for a long time. Then he spoke his final words, looking his grandson straight in the face. He said he hadn't believed in the fever for 11 years.
He said that the first rite of knowledge in this house had not been performed on Ison or anyone else. He said it had been performed on Hegel in secret, and that he suspected the only person who stood to gain from it. He did not name a name. He stood up and walked to the door, and at the door he said that if his grandson found the truth, he should come to him first. He left. Ison sat motionless. In a single night, he had learned more than he had in a year, and the system hadn't triggered even once because his grandfather hadn't used him or humiliated him. His grandfather had spoken to him as an equal. In the morning, he went to the ancestral hall and found the memorial lists from 11 years ago on the bottom shelf. Hegel wasn't there. A page had been torn out. He ran his finger along the tear and realized it had been torn out recently. The paper was still light-colored at the edge. And then something he hadn't expected happened. His mother called him into the small hall and said that hard times had come for the household and that the debt to the House of Yosan had to be paid off. She said that the House of Yosan had sent a proposal. The House of Yosan was offering to write off 200 silver coins in exchange for an engagement. Not with Saryeon. The Yosan house wasn't asking for anyone as a wife for their second son. Instead, the Yosan house was proposing to marry their daughter to the youngest son of the Hanwol house, to him. His mother said the Yosan house had agreed. She said it was a great honor and that the family was grateful to him for proving himself useful in this way as well. She said that nothing was required of him except his consent and his presence. She said that the ceremony would take place in 5 years anyway, and that until then, the Yosan household should consider him their son-in-law.
She said this aloud in the presence of two maidservants and Pyong. There was a clicking sound 4 times in a row. The Yosan delegation arrived 12 days later. 3 people came. The head of the Yosan clan, Muryeon, was 60 years old and 17 paces tall. His eldest son, and a 12-year-old girl named Hanbyol. They were received in the main hall, and Gyeosan spoke of the long-standing friendship between the two houses and of how a debt between friends is not a debt, but a bond. Muryeon listened without interrupting. He was a large, slow-moving man with heavy eyelids, and he looked not at the speaker, but at the person being spoken of.
He looked at Ison throughout the entire conversation. Hanbyol sat upright next to her father and did not raise her eyes. She was 5 measures and 2 parts tall, a typical height for a 12-year-old in a well-to-do household. The terms were read aloud. The Yosan house would pay 200 in silver today and another 140 on the wedding day. The wedding would take place in 5 years when the youngest son of the Hanwal house turned 16. Ison sat third at the table, listening and counting the dates. The wedding was set for his 16th year. The rite of union was set for his 16th year. The Hanwal house was set to receive 140 silver for a groom whom they had no intention of keeping alive until the wedding. He looked up at his father. Gyeosan was speaking about the alliance between the two houses, and his expression was calm. He knew what he was doing. This wasn't the first time he'd done this. Hanbyol raised her head, and they looked at each other across the table. She was 12. He was 11. She looked straight at him and didn't look away first. The contract was signed that same evening. After signing, Muryeon asked to be shown the garden and requested that the boy be allowed to go with him. They walked along the path in silence. Then, Muryeon asked how much he actually had. Isan replied that he had 13 mur. Muryeon said he hadn't asked how much he claimed to have. He said he'd asked how much he actually had. Isan remained silent. Muryeon nodded and said that was what he'd thought. Then he said something important. He said he was taking him as a son-in-law not because of his wealth. He said that the Yosan house had been doing business with the Hanwal house for 20 years, and that over the past 4 years, the Hanwal house had missed deadlines 3 times and forged invoices twice. He said the forgeries had stopped 3 years ago, precisely when an 11-year-old apprentice began keeping the shelter's ledgers. He said that a man capable of seeing another's deception through books is worth more than a man with 20 measures of wealth. He concluded by saying that he had only 1 daughter and that he would not give her to a house that was sinking. He said that he was looking 5 years ahead and that he advised others to look there as well. Then he left. Throughout the entire conversation, the system didn't beep even once. Muryeon didn't carry Hanwal's blood and spoke to him as a human being. Months passed, and they went by in flashes. First flash. The house pays off 200 in silver, and things get a little easier for a month. Gyeosan buys horses to replace the ones that were sold. The debt remains at 240. Second installment. Ision's travelogue is returned, and an expense log is added. At 11 years old, he manages the branch's finances entirely on his own. In the first month, he uncovers 60 silver in leaks. He shows half to his father, but keeps the other half to himself. Third scene. Sadyeon stops coming to the communal table. She studies alone in the far hall, and they no longer hire a tutor for her because there is no money. She has been at the 8th measure and 6 parts for 4 years. Fourth scene. Desu leaves home. He leaves for his mother's family home in the younger branch, and before departing, he shouts to Gyeosan in the courtyard that the branch has rotted and that everyone can see it except him. He shouts, and 12 people hear him. He never once mentions Ison and does not lose a single share. Fifth scene. His mother begins to fall ill frequently. The doctor cannot find the cause.
She owns 4 measures and 1 share and continues to tell the servants how useful her youngest son has become. Each time she mentions her share. 6th scene. Pyun grows old and hands the inventory over to Isun. He does this silently, without any words of transfer, and simply fails to return with the board one day. By winter, Isun knew everything about the household. He knew that the branch would not survive 3 years without the ritual. He knew that his grandfather had not left the upper estate for 4 months. He knew that his father had begun visiting herbalists in the lower valley and buying things that were not purchased for health reasons. And he found the page. He had searched for that torn page from the memorial lists for 8 months and found it where no one else had looked. He found it in an account book from 11 years ago, tucked between the pages instead of a bookmark. That's what people do when they hide something in a hurry and then forget about it. On the sheet were 3 names of those who had died that year: 9-year-old Hegel and 2 servants. Next to Hegel's name was a note written in Pyo's hand. The note was brief. The body was returned to the house and buried on the lower slope without a ceremony, per the mistress's orders. In that house, they referred to one woman as the mistress. Mother. Yun-hee.
He sat there with the sheet in his hands for a very long time.
11 years ago, Hegel was the only obstacle standing in the way of her daughter. 11 years ago, Hegel died of a fever at the shelter. His body was brought back in secret, buried without a ceremony, and the page was torn out. And for 4 years, his grandfather searched for the reason behind the family's decline, but never found it because he was looking in the wrong place. He went down to the lower slope that very night. He searched for 2 hours by moonlight and found a flat, unmarked stone at the edge of an old vacant lot. He sat down next to the stone and stayed there until dawn. He wasn't thinking about the brother he never knew. He was thinking about himself. In his past life, he had been laid on the slab at the age of 24, and everything had been done openly and with ceremony, and his name had been entered into the lists of the pillars. Hegel had been buried here without a marker at the age of 9. The difference between them was not in their fates. The difference was that Hegel hadn't had time to understand anything. In the morning, he went to see his mother. He walked into her room and placed the sheet of paper on the table in front of her. He didn't say a word. Yun-hee looked at the paper and recognized it immediately. She turned pale, and then did the worst thing she could. She screamed. She screamed that the boy was meddling in matters he had no business with. She screamed that he was rummaging through the dead man's papers. She screamed in front of the 2 maids and Saryeon, who had come in at the commotion, that he was an ungrateful creature whom they had raised for 11 years like livestock on a lease, and that he had no right to raise his voice at the one who had given him life and would take it back. She said this out loud in front of 3 witnesses. The click-clack continued without stopping. He saw her numbers slipping down. 4 and 1, 3 and 8, 3 and 4, 3 exactly. She stopped mid-scream and clutched her throat. Then she sank to the floor and collapsed on her side. The maids screamed. Saryeon stood in the doorway, looking back and forth between her mother and her brother, not moving. She heard everything. She heard the word beast and the word term, and she understood both. They carried her mother away. The physician arrived around noon and said that the lady had lost 3 measures of depth in a single hour, and that he had never seen anything like it. He said she would live, but would not be up and about anytime soon. By evening, grandfather arrived at the house. Taegon went up to the sick room and came out a minute later, ordering that his grandson be summoned. He was sitting in the small hall, and that very sheet of paper lay on the table before him. He was reading it when Isun entered. He didn't look up. He asked where the sheet had been lying. Isun answered. He asked who else had seen it. Isun replied that 3 maids, Saryeon, and he himself had seen it. Taegon placed the sheet on the table and covered it with his palm. He was silent for a very long time. Then he said that now he understood everything except one thing. He said he understood about Hegel, about his mother, and about the 11 years of silence. He said he didn't understand how an 11-year-old grandson could possess a depth of 17 measures. He named the exact number. He said he had measured it twice and both times had seen what had been shown to him, and that he wouldn't measure it a third time. He said that for 4 years he had been searching for where the clan's depth led, and that he had found the answer an hour and a half ago while looking at the woman who had lost 3 measures in a single conversation. He looked his grandson in the face and said one last thing. He said that the clan owed him. He said he didn't know what power caused this and didn't want to know. He said that, as the head of the clan, he was obligated to stop the decline at any cost. And he said he saw only 2 ways to do so. The first way was to perform the rite of union immediately, without waiting 16 years. He did not name the second way. He stood up and said he would convene the clan in 9 days, and that the clan would decide. Grandfather left the small hall, and the house stood still, like water before it begins to move. Ison went up to his room, sat by the window, and began to conduct. 9 days. The clan would gather in the main hall and make a decision. He knew how the clan made decisions. The clan decides as the chief decides. Taegon had named the first option but not the second, which meant he hadn't yet chosen the second one. So the 9 days weren't spent preparing for the ritual. The 9 days were spent waiting for the old man to make up his mind. Ison laid out everything he had in front of him, 17 measures and 8 shares. 13 had been shown. The household owed 240 in silver. His mother lay in bed and would not get up. His father had 12 measures and 1 share, and had not a single ally outside the household. Sadion heard the words beast and term, and after that she did not leave the far hall for 2 days. His grandfather had 20 measures and 3 shares, and was the only one in the house who could kill him with his own hands. And there was the Yosan household, with 17 measures of the head's share, a signed contract, and 140 silver coins, which the Hanwal household would receive only on the wedding day. He stared at this ledger for a long time. Then he realized something simple. All this time, he had been fighting the family alone. And the family had been fighting him with the entire clan. And he didn't have a single person with Hanwal blood on his side. He left the room that very night. He spent the first day with Pyong. The old man was sitting in the storeroom, rewriting old inventories because he didn't know how to stop working. Ishon placed a sheet of memorial lists in front of him. Pyong looked at his entry from 11 years ago and showed no change in expression. He said he had written it himself. He said the mistress had ordered it and he had written it down, and then remained silent for 11 years. Ishon asked why he had remained silent. Pyong replied that he had served the household for 43 years, that he had nothing but this service, and that the 9-year-old boy was dead and could not be brought back to life by his silence. He said this calmly and dryly, without remorse. Isun asked another question. He asked if Pyong would remain silent now. Pyong set down his quill and said no. He said that he had been compiling a registry of the branch's children for 4 years on the clan head's orders and knew more about this household than the head himself. He said that if the clan asked him in front of everyone, he would answer. He did not carry the blood of the Hanwal clan and had paid nothing. He had simply agreed. The second and third days were spent on paperwork. Ishon compiled the entire branch's finances for the past 11 years and drew up 2 accounts. The first account was about money. Over the past 11 years, the Hanwal household had spent 920 silver on sadyan, herbs from the coast, tutors from the Kyeryong Valley, and 3 years at the orphanage, clothes and outings. The second tally was about growth.
Over those same 11 years, Serion had grown from 9 measures to 8 measures and 6 parts. He compiled both columns on a single sheet, looked at them, and realized he was holding a weapon in his hands. The clan did not understand words about justice. The clan understood loss. The 4th day brought him a surprise. Serion came on her own. She walked in without knocking, sat down, and remained silent for a long time. Then she said she'd heard everything her mother had shouted. She said she'd been thinking about it for 2 days. She said she'd always known about the ritual and that it had been explained to her at age 8, just as one explains the order of things. She said she had never asked where the things they gave her came from. Then she said the most important thing. She said she had asked now. She said she had found, in her father's papers, the expenses for the fortifying potion for the far wing and had calculated the years. She said she understood why they had been feeding her brother for 8 years. She fell silent for a long time. Then she said she didn't know how to live with this now and that she'd come to ask what he wanted. Ison looked at her and did the math. 8 measures and 6 parts hung over her, and her debt was enormous, and it hadn't been paid off because she'd kept silent about it in public for 4 years. He told her half the truth. He said he wanted to live until he came of age. Serion said she would speak out against the right at the clan meeting. She said this quietly and resolutely, then stood up and left. He sat there, realizing that she had done this sincerely and that it didn't make him feel any better. She couldn't protect him. She was the reason all of this existed. The 5th day. He went to the Yosan household. He took a cart and told his father he was delivering the documents by the deadline, and his father gave his permission without looking up. Murion received him immediately. Ison placed a sheet of paper with 2 columns in front of him and said one thing. He said that the Hanwol household would not see the wedding through to the end, and that the Yosan household would never pay the 140 silver because the groom would not live to see that day. Murion read the columns slowly. Then he asked how the boy knew this. Ison replied that he knew the customs of his clan. Murion set the sheet aside and said that he had suspected something like this, which was why he had included a 2nd clause in the contract. He showed him the contract. The 2nd classification stated that, in the event of non-performance, the Hanwol family would return 200 silver coins, double the amount. He said he had included this to protect his daughter, and that now this clause would also protect the groom. He said that the Yosan house would not interfere in the clan affairs of another family, that it was forbidden by custom, and that no house would ever do such a thing. But he added one more thing. He said he had the right to demand compliance with the contract, and that if the Hanwol house declared the betrothed dead before the deadline, the Yosan house would come for 400 silver coins the very next day. He said the Hanwol house would not survive that. He wrote a letter, sealed it, and ordered it to be delivered personally to the head of the clan. Finally, he said that he was not doing this out of kindness, and that he was looking 5 years ahead, just as he had said. The 6th day. Ison returned and had Pyong deliver the letter to his grandfather. He did not appear in person. Taegon read the letter, said nothing, and called no one. The 7th day passed in silence, and that was the worst of it all. The 8th day ruined everything. In the morning, his father gathered the servants and announced that the lady's condition had worsened and that a herbalist from the lower valley would be coming to the house. Ison stood in the courtyard, listening and counting. His mother had been bedridden for 8 days, and the doctor had come twice, saying both times that she should be left alone. She didn't need any herbalist. He went to the pantry and pulled out the expense ledger for the past month. He found an entry for the 4th day. His father had paid 12 silver coins to a man from the lower valley. The purpose column read, "For herbs." You don't pay 12 silver coins for herbs. In the lower valley, 12 silver coins buy something else.
He recalled what he'd seen over the past few months but hadn't put together. His father had visited herbalists 4 times that winter. His father had been buying things that aren't bought for health reasons. He sat down on the sacks in the storeroom and finally pieced it all together. His grandfather summoned the clan 9 days later. Grandfather named the first method, but did not name the second. Father did not wait the 9 days. Father decided that the clan might choose the second method and that then everything would be lost.
And Father began to prepare his own plan. He went through the options and settled on the simplest one. The right of knowledge required the clan's consent and the presence of the head of the clan. The right required a living vessel, and the vessel's death without the ritual gave nothing to anyone. So Father wasn't going to kill him. So Father was going to render him incapable of resisting on the stone. He remembered the taste of the morning brew from the far wing. 8 years. A soft, pliable light that offers no resistance. His father wasn't buying poison. His father was buying the same thing they'd been feeding him for 8 years, only stronger. And then he realized something else, and at that realization, his fingers went cold. The brew didn't take effect immediately. The brew took effect over months. So his father hadn't started today. He pulled out the expense ledger for the past 6 months and found 3 more entries. The first one was made a week after his return from the shelter. He sat in the pantry with the ledger on his lap and recalled every cup he'd drunk in this house over the past 11 months. He checked himself right then and there, his palm on his sternum. 17 measures and 8 shares, exactly the same amount as before. Not a single fraction lost. He sat there a little longer and realized why. The system took from his relatives and gave to him. It didn't give him a bonus only when no one paid, but it never allowed him to lose any. What his father and the herbalist had done to him hadn't worked at all. He stood up, put the book on the shelf, and went out into the yard. The 9th day would begin in 6 hours. He didn't go to his grandfather. He didn't go to his father. He went to his mother's room. Yun-hee was lying on her side, staring at the wall. Exactly 3 measures. A woman who, over the course of 11 years, had lost more than half of herself. He sat down on the edge of the bed, and she didn't turn around. He told her that he knew about Hegel, that he knew about the decoction, and that he knew about the herbalist from the lower valley. He said that tomorrow the clan would decide, and that she could get up and come to the hall. He said that if she came and told everything herself, the clan would hear it from her. He said that if she didn't come, the clan would hear it from Pyeon and from the papers. Yun-hee turned her head. She looked at her youngest son for a very long time. Then she spoke, her voice dry. She said she had raised him for 11 years, knowing the day. She said she couldn't call it anything else now. She said she would come. He left her and stopped in the hallway, standing there with his hand on the wall. The system didn't click. She hadn't humiliated him or taken advantage of him. She had told the truth about herself. The next morning, the clan gathered. 23 people instead of 35. Relatives from the more distant younger branches arrived, and Desu arrived with his mother's relatives. The main hall was cramped and cold. Taegon sat down beneath the clan scroll and announced that the clan had gathered to decide the fate of the youngest son of the senior branch and to determine the cause of the clan's decline. He placed 3 items before him: a letter from the Yosan house, Pyeong's inventory for the past 4 years, and a 2-column sheet that Isan had passed to him through Pyeong the day before. He looked up and said he would listen first. He summoned Gyosan first. Gyesan stood up and spoke with confidence. He said what he always said. He said that the branch bears the burden of the clan, and that this burden requires investment. He listed the expenses for Saryeon,
and called them not a waste, but an investment. He said that the loss of depth stemmed from corruption brought in from outside, and that the house had been searching for the culprits for 4 years and had not found them only because it had been looking within. He said that the solution was simple, and that it had been decreed by the grandfather for the 16th year, and that now all that was needed was to bring the deadline forward. He sat down. Taegon did not reply. He picked up a sheet of paper with 2 columns and handed it to the eldest of the younger branch, ordering him to read it aloud. The man read for a long time. 920 in silver over 11 years. Growth from 9 measures to 8 measures and 6 parts. A loss of 4 parts over 11 years of investment. The hall fell very quiet. Distant relatives exchanged glances. They had contributed to the clan's common fund, knew where the money went, but did not know the final tally. Gyosan stood up and said that the figures were out of order and that the pillar's growth had stopped precisely because of the damage. Taegon asked him when the damage had begun. Gyosan said 4 years ago. Taegon opened Pyeong's inventory and read the date of the first decline in Saryong. 8 measures and 6 shares in Zamure 7 years ago. He said that the decline had begun not 4 years ago, but earlier, and that the first decline had occurred in the year when the youngest son of the branch was 8 years old. Gyosan said that proved his point all the more. He said that, in that case, everything pointed to the boy. He said this aloud, turned around, and pointed at him in front of 23 people. He said that the clan had fed and raised him and been patient with him, and that the clan had the right to take back what was theirs. There was a double click. Taegon raised his hand and Gyosan fell silent. The grandfather summoned Pyeong. The old man stepped into the center, stood up straight, and spoke in an even voice honed over 40 years of reading inventories. He said that he had kept the inventory of the branch's children for 4 years on the orders of the clan head, and that he was ready to confirm every entry. He said that the youngest son of the senior branch had been given a fortifying decoction from the age of 6 to 8, and that this decoction had been ordered separately from a herbalist and given to no other child in the clan. He said he knew the ingredients. He named them. The hall grew noisy. Distant relatives recognized the mixture. It was given to livestock before a long journey to keep the animals from getting restless. Taegon asked who had given the order. Pyeong said that the lady had given the order and the master had confirmed it. Gyosan leaped to his feet and shouted that the old servant had lost his mind and that he had been bribed. He shouted that Pyeong must be driven from the estate without compensation and that the clan would not listen to hired hands. He shouted for a long time and called Pyeong a dog of the far wing. Pyeong stood there listening, his expression unchanging. He waited for the shouting to end. Then he spoke his final words. He said that in 43 years he had never taken a single extra coin from the household and that he would leave the estate of his own accord that very day. He said there was still a document he had to hand over to the clan. He took a folded sheet of paper from his bosom and handed it to his grandfather. It was a sheet of memorial lists. Taegon unfolded it but did not read it. He knew what was there. He placed it on the table, pressed it down with his palm, and said that now he would speak for himself. He told the clan about Hegel. He recounted everything he had told his grandson. That the boy was his son by his second wife. That in the year of the clan's choice, the clan had chosen between 2-year-old Saryon and 9-year-old Hagil, and selected the elder branch. That Hagil had been sent to the orphanage, and less than a year later, news of his death had arrived. That he himself had paid the orphanage to keep silent. Then he picked up the sheet of paper and read aloud Pyeong's note. The body was returned to the house and buried on the lower slope without a ceremony, per the mistress's orders. The hall was silent. It was so quiet that you could hear the brazier crackling. Distant relatives stared at the floor. What had happened within the elder branch 11 years ago now concerned each of them, because each of them had been losing their depth for the 4th year in a row. And then the door opened. Yeon-hee entered on her own. 2 maids were supporting her by the arms, but in the middle of the hall she pushed them aside and walked alone. She was thin and pale, and she walked slowly. She reached the table, stopped, and looked at her husband. Then she spoke. She spoke softly, and the hall listened, holding its breath. She said that 11 years ago she had sent a man to the shelter. She said that the man had been paid 8 pieces of silver. She said she hadn't ordered a killing and that she'd instructed them to ensure the boy couldn't reveal the depth during the communal measurement. She said the man had gone too far. She said the body had been brought in at night and that she'd ordered it to be buried without a ceremony and the page torn out. She said her husband found out a month later and kept quiet. She said he kept quiet because by that time he had already started giving the younger son the decoction. She looked at Gyosan and said that they both knew the day for which they had raised the child and that this day had been inscribed in the ancestral plans before the child had even learned to walk. She fell silent. Then she said one last thing. She said she was losing her depth faster than anyone else in this house and that she knew why. She said that every time she called her son a vessel out loud, she felt worse. She said she didn't understand what force had arranged it this way and that she wouldn't ask for forgiveness because it was too late to ask for it. She sat down right on the floor in the middle of the hall and said nothing more. There was a single click, one share, the last one she could give. After that, everything happened quickly. Gyesan tried to speak, but no one listened to him. The eldest of the younger branch stood up and demanded a review of the clan's foundation. He said that for 11 years, the clan had invested in one who offered no growth, and that now the clan saw the cost of that investment. He said that over the past 4 years, the clan had lost nearly 6 measures of total depth, and that the cause had been identified. Aunt Hyeon shouted that the boy was to blame for everything, and that he must undergo the rite today. 2 people supported her. 4 objected. The hall began to split into opposing voices. And then Saryeon stood up. She stepped into the center and stood next to her mother, who was sitting on the floor. She was wearing a simple dress and had no silver in her hair, and everyone was looking at her. She said she was speaking on behalf of the one for whom all this had been done. She said that over the course of 11 years, she had received 920 in silver from the clan and had not grown even a fraction. She said she had spent 3 years at the orphanage and that her graduation certificate bore the word stagnation, and that 17 houses had read that certificate. She said she now understood where her depth was supposed to come from. Then she said the most important thing. She said she was refusing. She said she would not accept the rite, neither on her brother's 16th birthday nor on any other occasion. She said that if the clan insisted, she would leave the senior branch and the house and strike her name from the lists herself. The hall erupted. Gyosan shouted at his daughter. Hyeon shouted at Saryeon. The head of the junior branch shouted that the pillar must not dare to renounce the pillar. Saryeon stood in the midst of the shouting and did not move. And at that moment, Isun saw something he hadn't expected. 8 measures and 6 parts loomed over her, and her debt to him, for the first time in 11 years, began to diminish. Not to spill over into him, to diminish. He watched this and didn't understand, and then he understood. The debt had been swelling because she thought badly of him and remained silent. Now she had spoken aloud and spoken against herself. The debt was being eroded by her own choice. Taegon raised his palm and struck the table once. The hall fell silent. He stood up. He said that he had heard everything, that the decision would be his as head of the clan, and that no one would challenge it.
He said that the clan had lost nearly 6 over 4 years, and that the cause of this loss was neither a curse nor the malice of outsiders. He said the reason was that for 11 years, the clan had taken from one of its own to give to another, and that the Hanwol bloodline was such that a price must be paid for this. He said he did not know by what power this had been done and that it did not matter. He said that only the tally mattered. Then he announced his decision. He announced 3 parts, reading them out slowly. First, the right of recognition for the youngest son of the senior branch is revoked forever, and the ban is recorded in the clan registers. Second, Gyesan is removed from his position as head of the senior branch for concealing Hagil's death and for the potion. Young Hee is stripped of her title as Lady of the House. Third, he fell silent and looked across the hall at his grandson. He said that the clan is transferring the senior branch to the one who has managed its affairs for the past year. He named Isin the head of the senior branch of the Hanwol household. He was 11 years old. The hall fell silent. Gyosan stood up and said he would not hand it over. He said the clan had gone mad and that the senior branch was burdened with a debt of 240 silver, which the boy could not possibly repay. Taegon replied that that was precisely why he was handing it over. He said that in the 11 years under his leadership, the branch had lost everything, and that in just 1 year under the boy's leadership, it had recovered 60 silver in losses. He said that the clan did not value blood or seniority. The clan valued results. He sat down. Gyosan stood in the middle of the hall and looked at his son. And then Isun stepped forward for the first time during the entire council meeting. He bowed to his grandfather and said he would accept. Then he stated one condition. He said he would accept the branch only along with the debt of the Yosan household, and that he asked the clan not to interfere with how he would settle it. Taegon looked at him for a long time and agreed. He took over the branch the next morning, and the first thing he did was open the books in front of everyone. He brought 3 books into the main hall, laid them out on the table, and called together everyone who lived under the roof. 19 bloodbearers and 22 servants. He read aloud to them for 2 hours. He read the debt, 240 to the house of Yosan. He read the branch's income for the past year, 190. He read the expenses, 260. He said that the branch had been operating at a loss for 3 years and that in a year and a half it would cease to exist. He didn't blame anyone or name a single person. He simply read the columns. The people listened, and the hall grew quieter and quieter. In 11 years, no one in this house had ever seen the full account. Then he announced his rules, and he announced them briefly. First, the books are open to everyone, and anyone can come and read them. Second, as of today, all purchases of herbs from the coast and all payments to mentors are to cease. Third, the upper and lower tables are abolished. Everyone eats at the same table. Fourth, those who work receive a stipend, and this applies to blood-bearers just as much as to servants. Aunt Hyeon said that the Hanwol bloodline doesn't do manual labor. Ison replied that the Hanwol bloodline no longer has the money for that. He said this calmly, without looking at her. It clicked. She was one of the first to pay him in this life, and she had paid him right up until the very end. Then came months of cutbacks. First cutback. He sells the 3 upper fields to the Soran house through Tamun and charges a quarter more than market price because he knows from the shelter's ledgers how much the Soran house spends on grain and where their bottleneck lies. The debt drops to 170. Second cut. He switches the mine from daily wages to a share of production. The workers start bringing in twice as much. The branch's expenses drop by 1/3 in a single season. Third cut. He takes charge of the drying shed and restores the herb garden agreed upon 7 years ago.
The woman weeps in the courtyard and then works as hard as 2 people for 3 years. Fourth cut. He brings Pyon back. He goes to fetch him himself in the lower village, and the old man steps out onto the porch and says he has left the farmstead for good. Ison replies that the farmstead is different now. Pyon returns and oversees the inventory until his death 6 years later. Fifth scene. Saryeon asks for a job. He puts her in charge of the servants and all the women's household duties. She does well, and within a year, 40 people are working under her supervision. She never mentions the depths again.
By the end of the first year, the Yosan household's debt stood at 80 in silver, and the branch had turned a profit for the first time in 4 years. Muryeon came to see for himself. He walked around the courtyard, looking at the new roof and the people, and remained silent. Then he said that he had seen many households that had pulled themselves out of debt, and that all of them had done so within 10 years. He said that 13 months had passed here. He asked if Ison wanted to move the wedding date up. Ison replied that he did not. He said that Hanbyul was 13 and he was 12, and that the time frame in the contract was fine. He said one more thing. He said he wouldn't marry the daughter of the man who had saved him out of self-interest, and that he would marry when he himself was worth just as much. Muryeon laughed for the first time since they'd met. Over these months, Ison had grown very little. He'd received a total of 9 shares over the year, all from Haeon and 2 distant relatives. The house had stopped paying him because the house had stopped using him. He had become the head, and a head is never a mere vessel. He accepted this calmly. He was 18 measures and 7 shares, and at 12 years old, he was the most senior in the elder branch and the most senior in all 3 valleys. From then on, it was no longer the system that guided him. From then on, he was guided by what he knew how to do. His father died in the 2nd year. After his removal, Gyosan lived for a year and a half in the far wing, in the very same room where his youngest son had lived for 8 years. He did not work or go out and received an allowance from the common fund like everyone else. He died in the winter of pneumonia. Before he died, he called for his son. Ison came and sat by the bed, and Gyosan hesitated for a long time. Then he said that he had no regrets, that the clan needed support, and that he had provided that support. He said that if it all happened again, he would do the same. He said this in a clear voice and with full consciousness. Something clicked. One fate. The last one. He died 2 hours later. Ison buried him with full rites and a memorial plaque in the ancestral hall and did not say a single word at the grave. His mother lived longer. Yeon-hee hadn't gotten out of bed for 3 years, and Saryeon took care of her. She didn't speak to her son, and he didn't visit. Once she asked to be summoned. He came, and she told him one thing. She asked if he remembered that winter when he was 6 and fell ill, and she sat with him for 4 nights. He replied that he did. She said that even then she already knew about the ritual, and yet she had stayed by his side anyway. She said she didn't understand how those 2 things could coexist within her at the same time, and that she'd been thinking about it for 3 years and still couldn't make sense of it. She died a month later. The system didn't click even once during the entire conversation. In the 3rd year, he moved Hagel's remains. He lifted a flat stone on the lower slope by himself, and what he found fit into a single box. He buried his brother in the family row, placed a plaque with his name and branch designation, and entered his name in the memorial lists with the very same hand that Pyon had used to write the postscript 11 years earlier. Grandfather arrived for the ceremony and stood by his son's grave. He could not stand on his own and had to be supported. He was 80 years old and had 19 measures left. After the ceremony, Taegon took his grandson aside and said he wanted to ask one last question. He asked how it was done. Ison answered him truthfully.
He said that every bearer of the Hanwol blood who uses it, humiliates it, or betrays it loses a portion of its depth, and that this portion passes to him. He said he hadn't chosen this and couldn't stop it. He said that over the course of 11 years, the clan had given him nearly 17 heir, and that the clan had given them away itself with every word spoken aloud. Taegon listened in silence. Then he asked one question. He asked why he himself hadn't lost any. Aizen replied that his grandfather had lost it. He named a number. 22 measures on the day his grandfather first entered the courtyard, and 19 now. He said his grandfather had paid 3 times. The first time was when he presided over the rite. The second was when he named him the vessel at his birth. The third was when he announced the deadline for the 16th year. He said his grandfather had paid the least of all because he had never humiliated him personally. Taegon stood and looked at his son's grave. Then he said he understood. He said that the clan was structured in such a way that it could not help but pay, and that this was not a curse but a tally, and that this tally had always been kept, though there was simply no one to show it. He said he was glad to die knowing the reason. He died 8 months later. Before his death, he gathered the clan and handed over leadership of the entire Hanwol household to his grandson. He was 14 years old. One man objected, and that man was Desu. He had come from the younger branch of the family, stood up in the hall, and said that a 14-year-old could not lead the household, and that seniority existed for a reason. He spoke at length and concluded by saying that everyone present remembered who this boy really was, and that a scribe remains a scribe no matter how you dress him up. He said this in front of 30 people. There were 3 clicks. Desu had 1 measure and 3 shares left, and he lost another 3. He sat down on the floor in the middle of the hall and was led out by the arms. He lived many more years and never rose above 2 measures, and for the rest of his life, he told people in the lower valleys that the Hanwol house had been ruined by a curse. Aizen took over the house at the age of 14. He had 20 measures and 1 share, and he was more accomplished than his grandfather. He ruled the house for 4 years, and during those 4 years, the house of Hanwol rose higher than it had stood under his grandfather. The debt was paid off in full in Aizen's 15th year. In his 16th year, the house bought back the 2 fields sold under his father and opened a second mine. In the 17th year, the Hanwol house sent 3 apprentices to the Shelter of Branches for the first time in 19 years and paid their fees in advance. And in the 17th year, he married Han Byul. The wedding took place on the date specified in the contract, and Murion came in person and paid 140 silver coins down to the last coin, even though the Hanwol household no longer needed them. He said that a contract is a contract. Hanbyul entered the household at 18, standing 6 measures tall, and within half a year was running half the household. She was calm and stubborn and understood people better than her husband. She was the first person in his life who owed him nothing and wanted nothing from him. Over the course of 4 years of his rule, he received 22 shares from the clan. Everything the clan could give him, it had already given. 20 measures and 2 shares, and the growth had stopped. And then he returned to what he had seen at 15 measures on the night after his sister was taken away. A thread extending from him beyond the edge of the bloodline network. He searched for it for 3 years and found it not where he had been looking. He found it in the papers. The Conval house corresponded with 4 other houses, and Aizen read everything himself. In his 18th year, a letter arrived from the Carrion house in the Upper Valley proposing a trade alliance. The letter was ordinary. What was unusual was the seal. The seal bore a symbol he had seen only once in his life. He had seen it on the back of that very same empty bundle in the archives of the Shelter of Branches 9 years ago. He traveled to Carrion himself. The House of Carrion was twice the size of Hanwal, ruled over 2 valleys, and never revealed its head to anyone. He was received by the senior steward. Eisen sat in the reception room for 2 days, and on the 3rd day, he told the steward one thing. He said he wished to speak with the person who, 11 years ago, had paid the Shelter of Branches 8 silver coins for their silence. He was ushered in an hour later. The head of the Carrion House was a woman. She was nearly 60 years old. Her name was Sogyong, and she possessed a depth of 24 measures. She looked at the 18-year-old guest and said that she had been waiting for someone from the Hanwal clan for 10 years and had not expected to be met by a boy. She told him everything herself, and she spoke quickly because she saw no point in dragging it out. She said that the House of Carrion and the House of Hanwal were of the same blood. She said that 200 years ago, the clan had split into 2 branches, and that the upper branch had gone to Carrion and changed its name. She said that the right of union had not been invented in Hanwal. The right had been invented before the split, and both branches had practiced it for 200 years. She said that in Kaeryong they had discontinued it 40 years ago. Aison asked why. She replied that the House of Kaeryong had noticed a pattern. She said that every clan practicing the right of knowledge grows weaker from generation to generation, and that they had calculated this based on their records spanning 180 years. She said the conclusion was simple. Convergence does not accumulate depth. Convergence pours it from a full vessel into a leaky one, and some of it is always spilled. She said that Carrion had abandoned the ritual and, over 40 years, had doubled in strength, while Hanwal had fallen to 1/3 of its former strength over the same 40 years.
Then Eisen asked about Hagel. Sogyun paused. She said the boy was her grandnephew through Taegon's second wife, and that she had learned of his existence when he was 8. She said she had sent someone to the orphanage to bring the child to her. She said she was 9 days too late. She said the man hired by Young Hee had acted first. She said she had paid the orphanage herself to keep the matter quiet so that it wouldn't come to light prematurely and so that she could keep him under her control. She said she had kept him under her control for 11 years, waiting for Hanwal to rot enough for her to take him entirely. She said this calmly and without shame. Then she said one last thing, and that was the reason he had come. She said that in the children of Hanwal's bloodline, what the old records call retaliation sometimes awakens. She said that in 200 years it had happened 4 times. She said it always happened to those upon whom the ritual was performed, and always to those who died under it. She said she didn't know how they returned, and that the records said only one thing: those who are betrayed by their own return. She said that all 4 met the same end. All 4 drained their lineage dry and were left alone. And after that, they did not live long, because a person who has taken everything a lineage can give ceases to have kin. She looked at him and asked how much he had collected. Aison replied, 20 measures and 2 shares. Sogyun said that the 4th one had collected 26 and died at the age of 31. She said that one cannot keep tallying indefinitely because the tally ends along with those who pay. He returned home and didn't sleep for 3 nights. He checked her words against his own records, and they matched. The Hanwal house had 35 blood-bearers during his childhood. Now there were 29. Of these, 6 were children born during his time. 14 adults remained who remembered the old order. He took a blank sheet of paper and wrote down all their names, placing 2 numbers next to each one: depth and debt. He stared at that sheet for a long time. Then he realized what he should have realized long ago. For most of them, the debt was 0.
The branch under his command had survived for 4 years without humiliating or exploiting anyone. The people who had been paying him for 11 years had stopped paying not because they were out of money. They had stopped because he had changed houses.
He himself had cut off his own source of income. And he sat there a little longer and realized a second thing, and it was more important. He could bring everything back. He was the head of the house. All he had to do was issue 3 or 4 orders. Restore the top table. Restore the division into the first and second order branches. Make it so that 29 people would once again look up to him from below, and once again say about him what they had said for 11 years. The debt would swell within a year. It would grow to 25 measures, to 26 like the 4th. He sat with that sheet of paper all night. In the morning, he burned it. He went out into the courtyard, and there was morning, and in the courtyard, Sarion was counting sacks of dried bark, while 3 children from the younger branch were hauling water alongside the servants and laughing as they did so. Hanbol stood on the gallery with a tally board. None of these people owed him anything. And then came the final moment. Silence unfolded within him for the 5th time, and this time it was very brief. He saw a thread stretching beyond the edge and saw where it was leading. It was not leading to Kedyeon or to Sogyeon. It was leading back. That night on the cold stone, at the age of 24, when his father held his hand, he understood the entire mechanism and grasped it in a single second. The system was not a gift. The system was that very transfer. It was the very same right of knowledge turned in the opposite direction and stretched out over a lifetime. He wasn't killed so that they could take him away. He was killed, and he returned, and the order remained the same. It was just that now his entire lineage lay on the slab, and he was the vessel. For 12 years, he did to his family exactly what his family had done to him in a single night. The only difference was in the speed, and in the fact that he didn't ask for consent, just as no one had asked him. He stood in the middle of the courtyard and realized that if he continued, he would become that very stone upon which he had been laid. He went into the house, called Hanbyul and Sarion, and told them he was leaving for a month. He took the 2 of them and drove to the shelter of branches. He rode 2 passes through the saddle and 1 along the river, arriving at the flat summit around noon. 12 trees with their tops cut off stood just as they had been. Master Yuran was alive. He was nearly 60, and he was still leading the first circle. He recognized his former student immediately and was not surprised by his arrival. He said he had been waiting for him for a long time, and that he had been waiting for one reason alone. He said that in 26 years he had seen 3 disciples who stepped onto the stone knowing their number in advance. He said that 2 of them met a bad end. Ison stayed at the shelter for 11 days. He didn't look for papers or dig through the archives. He watched the children. 12 students in the courtyard summoned light into their palms and held it until the count was reached. Among them were 3 from the Hanwol house. He watched them from the gallery in the mornings and counted them. The youngest was 9 years old. His name was Gaon. He was from the younger branch and had 4 measures, an ordinary child of ordinary depth. No one in the house had raised him for a specific purpose. No one had fed him anything special. He slept in the common room, ate at the communal table, and quarreled with his neighbor over the seat by the window. On the 11th day, Ison realized why he had come. He had come to see what he lacked, and to make sure that others now had it. He returned home and summoned the clan. 29 people gathered, and it was the first full gathering in 5 years. He sat not beneath the clan scroll, but to the side, and spoke briefly. He announced 3 things. First, the right of knowledge is banned in the House of Hanwol forever,
and the ban is to be recorded as the first entry in the family registers. He said that this was neither an act of mercy nor a remembrance of his own fate. He said that he had examined the records spanning 180 years and that the right did not gather depth but rather squandered it. He said that every house that practices the right of knowledge grows weaker from generation to generation, and that the house of Hanvol had fallen by a factor of 3 in 40 years, and that the reason had been identified. He said that he was banning it not out of conscience but based on the records, and that anyone could verify those records. Second, the concept of a clan's pillar no longer exists. He said that the house would no longer invest everything in one person and deprive the rest. He said that resources are distributed according to labor and need, and that the books are open. Third, he relinquished his leadership of the house. A murmur rose in the hall. He raised his hand and finished speaking.
He said that he would remain head of the senior branch and of the estate, and that leadership over the entire household would pass to a council of 5 people from the 5 branches. He said that one man holding the clan in an iron fist was what had started it all. He said that he did not want to be the one whom the clan would one day look upon the same way it had looked upon his father. The council convened that very day. It consisted of Sadion from the senior branch, 3 from the junior branches, and 1 from the extended family. That same night, he sat alone in his room and waited. He didn't know what he was waiting for, but he waited anyway. Silence fell for the 6th and final time. It was not like the silences before. On previous occasions, something inside him had opened up. This time, something inside him closed. He felt something cold and very old, something that had settled beneath his breastbone at the age of 8 in the courtyard by the pomegranate barrel, unfold to its full length and fold back in on itself. And then he knew the final truth. The account was closed. The family's debt to him had been paid in full. He sat motionless, waiting to see what would happen next. Nothing happened next. Not a single measure was deducted. Not a single fraction was added. It simply stopped clicking. He raised his palm, placed it on his sternum, and counted. 20 measures and 2 fractions. The same as yesterday. The same as there would be tomorrow. He stepped out onto the balcony and looked down at the courtyard, seeing it through the eyes of a human being rather than a counter. There were no numbers above the people below. He watched for a long time, and nothing appeared. He saw Sadion walking across the courtyard with a surveying board, just a 31-year-old woman in a simple dress. He saw 2 children by the well, just children. He stood on the gallery, holding onto the railing, and realized that he had 20 measures and 1 life left, and nothing more than that. And that this was exactly what he had wanted at the age of 8, when he sat by the wall of the far wing with a shard of a bowl in his hand, counting not for revenge, but simply to keep track. What followed was a long life, and it passed in flashes. The first flash, 30 years. The Hanwol house controls 4 valleys and 2 mines and holds no rituals. People from the 6 houses come to him to see how the estate is run. He shows the ledgers to anyone who asks. The second flash. 34 years. Sogyun of the Kyun house dies and, before her death, sends him lists spanning 200 years. He reads them, finds the names of all 4, and enters them into his own lists next to Hagel's name. As the 5th name, he writes his own and leaves the line unfinished. Third timeline. 40 years old. Sadion dies childless. She spent her life counting sacks and people, and she was good at it. Before her death, she tells her brother that she's glad she didn't become a pillar. She says that being a pillar means when everything is placed on your shoulders and then they ask why you couldn't handle it. He buries her in the family row
next to Hegel. Fourth flashback. Fourth 7 years old. Gaion, from the younger branch, becomes the head of the House Council. He is 12 measures old and does not know what the reckoning is because the ban was added to the lists before he was born. Fifth segment. 52 years. Hanbyul dies in the winter, and he sits with her for the last 4 nights, just as his mother once sat with him. He thinks about this for all 4 nights and finally understands what his mother couldn't figure out in 3 years. People reconcile the incompatible within themselves because they do not reflect. Reflecting on oneself is painful. He lived to be 68. He was neither the first nor the last in depth among the 3 valleys. The boys born during his lifetime grew up, and some of them surpassed him. He watched this calmly. He died in the spring in his room in the East Wing, surrounded by his 4 children and 7 grandchildren, and none of them knew why their grandfather had been struck from the senior branch as a child because he had never spoken of it. Before his death, he asked for the family genealogies to be brought to him. They brought them to him. He opened to the first page, where the very first line contained a ban on the right of knowledge, written in his own hand 50 years earlier. He stared at that line for a long time. Then he asked them to turn to the memorial section and found the name of 9-year-old Hegel, alongside 4 names from the Kerion lists and his own name with an unfinished line. He asked for a quill. They gave it to him. He finished writing his line himself. He wrote a single word. He wrote that the account was closed. Then he handed back the quill, closed the book, and told his son to put it on the bottom shelf of the ancestral hall, where any child in the house could reach it. He said the book should be given to children to read starting at age 8. He said that by age 8, they already understand everything. He died at dawn. He was buried in the family row at the Hanwal house, between his older brother, whom he had never seen alive, and his older sister, for whose sake they had once planned to kill him. The Hanwal house stood for another 200 years, and not once during those 200 years did it perform the rite of enlightenment on any of its children. And on the bottom shelf of the ancestral hall lay the book that children were given to read starting at age 8. Its first line contained a prohibition, and its last line consisted of 3 words written in a faint hand. The account is closed.